Welcome to Deep Horror Stories to Sleep with Volume 9. Tonight's tales are darker, more chilling, and designed to linger long after the lights go out. If you enjoy gripping horror that keeps you on edge, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Now let's begin. Elliot had always enjoyed taking the train. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks, the soft hum of conversations, and the occasional flicker of lights overhead created a strange comfort. This time, however, something felt off. The train was unusually empty for an early evening commute. Elliot counted only a handful of passengers scattered across the dimly lit car. A man in a suit reading a newspaper, a young woman listening to music, and an older couple whispering to each other. Despite the sparse crowd, the atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive even, as if the air itself resisted being inhaled. As the train pulled away from the station, Elliot leaned back against his seat and glanced out the window. The cityscape blurred into a dark expanse of trees and empty fields. He frowned. The train never took this route. He stood and approached the nearest passenger, the man with the newspaper. "Excuse me, do you know if this is the right train to Westboro?" The man didn't respond. He didn't even look up. His eyes were fixed on the paper, though Elliot noticed the pages didn't move. "Sir," he tried again, louder this time. The man remained motionless, his hands gripping the newspaper tightly. Elliot's stomach churned. He turned to the young woman with headphones. "Hey, sorry to bother you, but I think this train might be going the wrong way." She didn't react either. Her head nodded slightly, as though she were keeping time to music, but her eyes were glazed, staring at nothing. Panic began to creep in. Elliot approached the older couple who were still whispering. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cracking. "Do you know where this train is going?" The couple stopped whispering. Slowly, they turned their heads toward him in unison, their faces devoid of expression. Their mouths opened, but no words came out. Instead, a low, guttural hum filled the air, growing louder and more distorted with each passing second. Elliot stumbled back, his heart racing. He turned toward the exit door between the cars, desperate to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. But as he reached for the handle, the lights flickered violently, plunging the car into darkness. For a few moments, the only sound was the relentless clatter of the train speeding down the tracks. Then the lights flickered back on, dimmer than before. The passengers were gone. Elliot's breath hitched as he spun around, scanning the car. Every seat was empty, yet the train still moved, its mechanical hum now louder, more menacing. He rushed to the window, pressing his face against the glass. The outside world was gone, replaced by an impenetrable black void. No trees, no fields, no stars, just nothingness. "Hello," he shouted, his voice echoing eerily in the confined space. "Is anyone here?" A soft click came from behind him. Elliot froze, his skin crawling. Slowly, he turned to see a shadowed figure standing at the far end of the car. Its shape was vaguely human, but its edges were indistinct, as if it were carved from smoke. "Who are you?" Elliot demanded, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It began to move toward him, its steps unnaturally smooth, almost gliding. Elliot backed away, his legs shaking. He reached for the emergency brake, but the lever wouldn't budge. The figure drew closer, its presence suffocating. "Stay back," Elliot shouted, his hand fumbling for anything he could use as a weapon. He grabbed a loose metal pole and swung it wildly, but the figure didn't flinch. It stopped a few feet away, tilting its head as if studying him. Then it raised an arm, pointing a long, slender finger toward the floor. Elliot followed its gesture and saw something that made his blood run cold. The floor beneath him was fading, dissolving into the same black void outside the window. He could feel the pull of the emptiness, a sickening sensation that tugged at his very being. "No," he whispered, stumbling backward. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The figure extended both arms now, the void spreading faster, consuming the seats, the walls, the ceiling. The train groaned, its structure twisting and warping as if being swallowed whole. Elliot screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. The last thing he saw was the figure's featureless face, leaning closer, its presence a whisper in his mind. "You were never going anywhere," and then silence. The train was found the next morning, empty and stationary on the tracks. Authorities couldn't explain why it had stopped or where its passengers had gone. The only clue was a single word scrawled on the window in condensation: "Lost."
It was a moonless night when Theo found himself on the narrow, winding road that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. His headlights cut through the thick fog, barely illuminating the faded lines that marked the pavement. The rain had been falling in a steady drizzle for hours, turning the earth into a slick, dark mirror. As the tires of his car whispered over the wet road, a strange unease prickled at the back of his neck, as if something was watching him from the shadows, though there was nothing in sight. Theo was used to long drives, often taking these back roads between jobs. The isolation didn't bother him. In fact, he preferred it, just him and the road. But tonight felt different. There was a heaviness to the air, a quiet that stretched far beyond the usual stillness of the countryside. He pulled over to the side, his headlights now cutting across the thick forest on both sides, the trees seemingly closer than they had been moments before. A sharp, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears, like a twig snapping underfoot. His pulse quickened, but he shook his head, dismissing the thought. There was nothing out here but the wind and the rain. He was about to get back in his car when he saw it, something moving in the trees. Just for a moment, a brief flash of motion, too quick for him to make out any details. It was gone before he could even register it properly. He hesitated, the hairs on his neck standing up. His instincts told him to keep driving, to get out of there and continue on his way, but something about the scene kept him rooted to the spot. The rain began to pick up again, turning the forest into a blur of dark shapes and shadows. Theo's mind raced, trying to rationalize what he'd just seen. It could have been an animal, or perhaps his eyes were playing tricks on him. He'd been driving for hours, and fatigue was starting to set in. But then he heard it again. A whisper, faint but distinct, drifting through the crack in his window. "Help." The word was barely audible, but it sent a jolt of electricity through him. His eyes darted across the trees, scanning for any sign of movement. There was nothing. No sound but the rain and the faint hum of his engine. But that whisper, his mind couldn't let it go. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but where could he go? The road ahead seemed just as dark and deserted as the one he had just traveled, and the idea of turning back felt absurd. There was no one out here, no other car in sight, no sign of life beyond the occasional flicker of headlights in the rearview mirror. Reluctantly, Theo put the car in gear and began to drive again, the tires slapping against the wet road. The whispers in his mind began to grow, the word "help" echoing in his thoughts like a slow drumbeat. It was as though the forest itself had begun to speak to him, warning him, urging him to turn around. Ahead, the road dipped into a sharp curve. As he rounded the bend, his headlights briefly illuminated a small, dilapidated shack that seemed to rise out of nowhere. The structure was crooked, its windows broken, and the door hung ajar, as if waiting for someone, or something, to enter. Theo's heart rate picked up again, but he couldn't stop himself. The strange pull, the whispering, the feeling of being watched, it all pointed toward that shack. Against his better judgment, he slowed the car and steered toward the shack. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, and the only sound now was the rhythmic thrum of water on his windshield. He parked in front of the shack, the engine's hum fading as he turned it off. He sat in the silence for a moment, his breath shallow, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The door of the shack creaked open. Theo's heart skipped a beat. The door, seemingly of its own accord, creaked on its hinges, as if an invisible hand was pushing it open. A gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and something faintly rancid. The hairs on his arms stood up. He couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear any movement beyond the rhythmic drip of the rain, yet there was no mistaking it. The door was wide open now, and it seemed to beckon him. The shadows inside were thick, impenetrable, as though the darkness itself had settled into that small, decaying space. Theo's fingers tightened on the door handle. His gut screamed at him to drive away, to forget what he had seen, but there was something inside him, something deep and urgent, that told him he had to go in. Something about the shack was familiar, though he couldn't place why. He exhaled sharply, trying to shake off the irrational fear creeping up his spine. This was absurd. He was tired, alone in the middle of nowhere. There was no reason to be afraid of a little abandoned building. His legs felt heavier with every step as he approached the shack, each footfall sinking into the mud just a little deeper. He reached the rickety stairs, each step groaning under his weight, and before he could second-guess himself, he pushed open the door. It was colder inside, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The room was shrouded in darkness, save for a faint sliver of moonlight peeking through a crack in the boarded-up window. A strange, oily substance pooled on the floor, but Theo couldn't tell whether it was water or something more sinister. As his eyes adjusted, he saw movement in the far corner. He froze. A shape, no, a shadow, shifted, slow and deliberate. Then a whisper, no louder than a breath, fluttered through the air. "Help me!" It wasn't the same voice from earlier, but it was close, soft, pleading, laced with desperation. His breath caught in his throat, but his feet, as if moving on their own, carried him forward. Each step was a battle against the fear gnawing at him, but he couldn't stop. He had to know. He rounded the corner, and his eyes widened in horror. There, lying in the corner of the room, was a woman. Her clothes were torn, her skin pale and sickly, streaked with blood and grime. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at him with an intensity that felt almost unnatural. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They won't stop. Help me." Theo's heart pounded in his chest, but something stopped him from retreating. The woman's gaze locked onto his, her lips moving slowly, as though she were trying to form words that wouldn't come. There was something terribly wrong about her, something that set his instincts on high alert. She looked too still, too lifeless, as if she had been dead for far longer than she let on. Suddenly, the shack door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. Theo spun around, his pulse racing. The room seemed to close in around him. The woman on the floor didn't move, her eyes never leaving his face. The air grew thick, heavier somehow, and the sound of the rain outside faded, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then he heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from the darkness beyond the woman. Theo's stomach lurched. He turned slowly, and for the first time, he saw what had been lurking in the corner of the room. Shambling toward him was another figure, a grotesque, misshapen silhouette, its body contorted unnaturally. Its arms hung low, scraping against the floor like claws, dragging itself forward with terrifying purpose. The smell of rot and decay wafted from it, a stench so overpowering that it made his throat tighten. Its face was twisted, half of it barely there, the flesh eaten away to reveal exposed bone, its eyes empty pits that burned with a malicious hunger. "Help me," the woman's voice came again, but this time, it was no longer a plea, it was a command. Theo felt his breath catch in his throat, his legs frozen to the spot. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out, but the door was locked, and the woman's gaze still held him captive. The thing was almost upon him now, its movements jerky, violent. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, only act. He stumbled backward, reaching for the door, his hands slamming against the wood. The thing behind him growled louder, its gaping maw opening, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. The door wouldn't budge. Theo's heart pounded in his chest as he desperately shoved against the door, his hands slick with sweat. The growling behind him grew louder, more insistent, and the foul, rancid odor from the creature curled around him like a thick fog. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out everything except the sound of his own terror. He turned, glancing over his shoulder just in time to see the creature's rotting hand swipe at the air. It missed by mere inches, but the force of the strike was enough to send a ripple of dread through him. He backed away, his eyes frantic, scanning the room for any escape. The woman was still staring at him, her unmoving body sprawled on the floor, her eyes now glistening with something dark and unholy. Her lips curled into a faint, twisted smile. "It won't let you go, none of us can leave." Theo didn't have time to process her words. His legs moved instinctively, pushing him toward the back of the shack, where an old window, framed in rusted metal, barely hung on its hinges. The creature was too close now, too fast. He could feel its presence, hear its breath rasping in the silence. He reached the window, desperate, his fingers fumbling against the jagged edges of the frame. His pulse raced as his mind raced, fighting against the overwhelming sense of doom closing in. A sickening realization dawned. He wasn't just trying to escape. He was trapped in some kind of endless nightmare. A sharp tug at his sleeve jolted him back to the present. He spun around to find the woman's skeletal hand wrapped around his arm, her grip unyielding. Her eyes gleamed with something strange, something malevolent, and her voice rang out once more, this time a growl. "You're one of us now." Theo screamed, a guttural, desperate cry, as he wrenched his arm free from her grip. The window was his only hope. Without hesitation, he shoved the frame upward, the sound of metal scraping against rusted hinges filling the air. But just as he managed to push the window high enough to squeeze through, he heard the growl again, closer this time, as though the creature was right on top of him. He had only seconds. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his hands shook as he slipped his body through the window, dragging his legs through the jagged metal and splintered wood. He fell hard onto the wet ground outside, his body hitting the earth with a sickening thud. For a moment, the world spun around him, the cold air stinging his skin. His ears rang with the thudding of his own heartbeat. He pushed himself up, desperate, stumbling to his feet, only to find himself face to face with the thing, the monster that had been chasing him. It was closer now, standing just feet away, its broken body twitching and jerking with each movement. It opened its mouth wide, revealing rows of gnashing teeth, and Theo saw, with a jolt of horror, that the creature's eyes were no longer dark pits. They were glowing, an unnatural, sickly yellow, and they locked onto him with a ferocity that took his breath away. Before he could react, the creature lunged. Theo's body reacted instinctively, and he dove sideways, rolling across the wet earth to escape the beast's snapping jaws. His heart raced as he scrambled to his feet, but the creature was relentless. It was on him in an instant, its weight crashing down, its rancid breath hot against his face. He could feel its sharp claws scraping across his skin, its teeth just inches from his throat. His body screamed in pain as he fought, pushing against the creature, desperate to break free. But then, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. He felt a strange shift in the air, a vibration that ran through his entire body. Something was changing. The creature froze, its body quivering as if it were being pulled by an unseen force. Its jaws snapped shut with a horrific sound, but it didn't lunge again. Its body seemed to twitch, then jerk violently, as if caught in some kind of paralysis. Theo didn't wait to find out what was happening. With every ounce of strength he had left, he shoved the creature off of him and scrambled to his feet. He turned and ran, the shack and the twisted figure already fading from his view, his mind clouded with fear and confusion. But as he stumbled through the rain-soaked forest, one thought kept repeating in his mind. He was far from free. Theo's breath was ragged as he pushed through the thick underbrush, his legs aching from the strain. The rain beat down harder now, drenching him, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but the more he thought about it, the more confused and afraid he became. That thing, the creature, had been too strong and natural. The woman, too, had been wrong in some unfathomable way. He had to get away. He had to keep running. The forest seemed endless, an impenetrable maze of shadows and twisted trees. The rain created a deafening roar around him, but even through that he thought he heard something. A noise, distant but unmistakable, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, trailing him. Theo's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't let it catch him. He had to push forward. His chest tightened as the noise grew louder, closer. Each step felt heavier, his body dragging with exhaustion. He stumbled, his foot catching on a root hidden beneath the thick carpet of fallen leaves, and he fell hard to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a moment he lay there, trying to catch his breath. He didn't hear the footsteps anymore. He pushed himself up, wiping mud from his hands, but as he stood, he felt something cold and wet touch the back of his neck. His blood ran cold. Slowly he turned around. Nothing. Just the dark forest, the rain, the distant rustle of the trees. Theo exhaled shakily. It was just his mind playing tricks on him. He had to stay focused, keep moving. But before he could take another step, something shifted in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible disturbance. The wind changed direction, carrying with it the same rancid odor he had smelled in the shack, the one that had made him gag. A sound, almost like a low growl, vibrated through the trees. He spun, eyes wide, searching frantically, but there was nothing there. Only the rain, the trees, the darkness. And yet, Theo felt it. Something was watching him, lurking just out of sight. His pulse quickened. The world felt wrong, as though the very forest had turned against him, as if the ground beneath his feet was alive, watching, waiting for him to slip. He backed away, his eyes darting nervously from one shadow to the next, but it was no use. The growl grew louder, more distinct, until it sounded like it was coming from all directions at once. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement, too fast to fully register. The creature. It was there. He turned, his legs screaming in protest, and he ran. The trees seemed to close in on him, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands, slapping at his face as he barreled through the underbrush. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how hard he pushed, it felt as though the thing was always right behind him, just out of sight. A scream ripped from his throat as he collided with a thick tree, his body slamming into the rough bark. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his hands pressed to his chest as his heart raced. He wasn't alone. There was no way out. A soft whisper, cold and breathy, brushed against his ear. It was the woman's voice again. "Escape is an illusion." Theo froze. His body went rigid with dread. He twisted, desperate to see where the voice was coming from, but the forest seemed to warp and distort, the trees bending in unnatural angles, as though the very landscape itself was alive, watching. The growl returned, louder now, followed by a sickening scrape, like claws dragging across stone. He didn't have time to think. His feet moved before his mind could catch up, carrying him deeper into the forest, his legs burning with fatigue. His breath came in ragged gasps, but all he could hear now was the sound of the thing closing in on him. It was getting closer. He pushed through the pain, forcing himself to keep running, but the forest seemed endless, an oppressive, suffocating expanse that swallowed him whole. His feet slipped in the muck, and every time he thought he was losing it, he heard the growl again, right behind him. He wasn't getting away. Something sharp raked across his back, drawing blood. Theo cried out, stumbling forward, but he didn't dare look back. His vision blurred with tears, and his mind screamed for him to stop, to rest, but he couldn't. He couldn't stop running, or the thing would get him. Suddenly, his foot caught on a root. He crashed to the ground, the air forced from his lungs in a violent whoosh. He tried to push himself up, but his body refused to cooperate. His limbs felt like lead, and the ground seemed to pull at him, sucking the energy from his bones. Then a low laugh, deep and guttural, rose from behind him. Theo froze. The sound of it sent a chill down his spine, freezing him in place. It wasn't the woman. It wasn't the creature either. It was something worse. Theo's body refused to obey him. Every muscle screamed with the effort to move, but his limbs felt paralyzed, as if the ground beneath him had turned to stone. He could feel it then, the oppressive weight of whatever was behind him. That sick, gnawing laughter echoed through the trees again, reverberating in his chest, as if the very forest had come alive with malice. The rain fell harder, its rhythm almost mocking in its insistence. His chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow, desperate gasps. He didn't dare look behind him, but the sense of someone, looming over him was too strong to ignore. The air grew colder, and the trees around him seemed to bend inward, as if pressing closer. His hands reached out for something, anything, but all he felt was the cold, damp earth and the sharp edges of broken branches. The smell that had lingered before, the foul, rotten scent, was stronger now, clinging to him like a fog. It was choking, suffocating, and it made him gag. And then there was the sound of movement. Slow, deliberate. Too close. His heart hammered in his chest as he forced himself to turn, his eyes darting through the shadows. Through the haze of rain and mist, he saw something, two glowing eyes, low to the ground, watching him from between the trunks of two trees. They weren't the eyes of the creature. These were different, more intelligent, more aware. Theo's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't alone. A figure stepped out of the shadows, its form blending with the night like a specter. It didn't move like the creature. It didn't stumble or twitch. It walked with purpose, its steps calculated and deliberate, and the closer it got, the more its presence seemed to distort the world around it. The trees bent, the ground seemed to ripple beneath his feet. The woman's voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't from behind him. "Do you think this is the end? Or is it the beginning?" Theo's chest tightened in panic. He scrambled backward, but the figure was already too close. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its features were obscured by the rain and the shadows, but its eyes glowed like embers in the dark. The laughter from earlier faded away, replaced by a low, guttural hum vibrating in the air. A cold breeze swept past him, and he felt it, the presence of something ancient. Something that had existed long before the creatures, before the woman, before everything he had experienced in the past few hours. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused. It was as if the world had closed in, pressing him down, suffocating him with its weight. The figure leaned in close, and Theo could see, just for a moment, the twisted shape of its face, its skin as black as night, with cracks running through it, like old stone worn smooth by centuries of erosion. It smiled, or at least he thought it did. Its mouth stretched too wide, revealing jagged, broken teeth. "You should have stayed inside," it whispered. Its voice was a mixture of pain and malice, a sound that vibrated in his bones, making every muscle in his body seize. Theo forced himself to speak, his voice trembling, barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" The figure's smile widened, impossibly wide, and the glowing eyes seemed to flicker with something dark. "What I want is not what you'll give me, but what I take, I always keep." Theo's mind raced. His pulse roared in his ears, drowning out the sound of the wind, the rain, the ominous hum that filled the air. He had to do something. There had to be a way out. But the figure was already moving closer, its presence suffocating him, closing in from all sides. It was then that Theo understood. He wasn't just running from the creatures. He wasn't just trying to escape the woman. The true horror was something older, something deeper, something that existed in the very fabric of the world itself. And it had found him. It had found them all. The figure's hand reached out, cold as ice, and Theo felt a sharp pain, like the very air around him was twisting, pulling at his skin. His vision blurred, and his legs buckled beneath him, his body unable to support the weight of what was happening. He gasped, unable to scream. The figure's hand closed around his arm, its grip unyielding, like steel. And then, just as Theo's consciousness began to slip away, a voice, familiar, cruel, whispered in his ear, "You belong to me now." The ground beneath him buckled, the world spinning in a disorienting whirl of darkness and pain. And as the last vestiges of his strength faded, he realized that the road he had tried to escape from, the path he had run so desperately down, had never been his to leave. He had walked it long before, and he would walk it forevermore. Theo's body hung limply in the figure's grasp, his chest heaving as his thoughts began to fragment. The world around him swirled like a nightmare, each movement of the figure distorting reality itself. The rain continued to fall, but now it felt colder, sharper, as if the water itself was turning against him, chilling him from the inside out. The figure's grip tightened, sending a shock of agony through Theo's arm. It didn't speak, but the silent weight of its presence pressed against him like an unbearable force. His limbs trembled, the muscles in his legs and arms screaming to move, to escape, but they were useless. It was as though his very essence had been drained, leaving him a hollow shell. Through the haze of pain, Theo caught sight of the woman in the distance, standing at the edge of the trees, watching him with those cold, unblinking eyes. She didn't move, didn't speak, but the strange connection between them was undeniable. She had led him here. She had been part of this, and the realization clawed at Theo's mind. The figure leaned closer, its breath, if it could be called that, cold and foul. "You see," it whispered, its voice like gravel scraping against metal, "the road was never meant to take you where you thought it would. You are not the first to travel down it. And you will not be the last." Theo's chest tightened in horror. He struggled, his voice a rasping whisper. "What is this place?" The figure's smile spread wider, the edges of its mouth curling with unnatural force. Its teeth glinted in the dim light, sharper now, almost inhuman. "It's not a place," it said, its voice low and mocking. "It's a path, one that's walked again and again. Those who wander here, they become part of the road. And the road is never finished." Theo's heart raced in his chest. He struggled against the grip that held him, trying to push back, to find a way out. But there was no escaping it. The road stretched endlessly, the trees surrounding him now like gnarled hands reaching out from the dark. The world felt like it was folding in on itself, and Theo realized with a gut-wrenching certainty that he was no longer part of the world he had once known. He was somewhere else. The figure's laughter returned, hollow and insistent, filling the space around them. Theo tried to turn his head, but his body refused to obey. He was trapped in this place, this twisted reality where time no longer existed, where the very air was thick with decay. A flash of movement caught his eye, a fleeting shape moving among the trees. The woman. She was closer now, but her presence was different. It wasn't just her physical form that had changed. There was something more to her, something that sent a chill crawling down Theo's spine. "Why are you doing this?" Theo's voice barely rose above a whisper, but the question seemed to carry far more weight than he intended. The woman tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak at first. She simply watched him, her eyes flickering with something almost amused. "You are here because you were meant to be," she finally said, her voice soft, almost comforting in its tone. "The road calls to those who are lost, those who seek something they can't name." Theo felt his stomach churn. "I didn't seek this," he managed to say, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "I don't belong here." The woman's smile grew, her lips curling like the edges of a twisted omen. "That's where you're wrong," she murmured. "You've always belonged here. It's just that now, you can finally understand." Theo's mind reeled, trying to grasp at the fleeting fragments of his past. He could remember the road, the endless drive, the feeling of being trapped in a cycle he couldn't break. He had run. He had tried to escape, but there was no escape. Not anymore. He wasn't free. The figure holding him leaned in closer, its breath seeping into his skin. Theo could feel the dark energy emanating from it like a physical force, drowning him in its oppressive weight. "The road takes what it's owed," the figure said, its voice now a deep rumble in his chest. "It always takes." Suddenly, the ground beneath Theo's feet began to tremble, a low, ominous rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The trees around them swayed, their roots breaking through the earth, rising like twisted, gnarled fingers. The world seemed to be crumbling, and Theo felt his resolve falter. "You won't be free," the woman's voice echoed in his ears. "None of us are." The air around him crackled with static. Theo could feel something shifting, like the very fabric of the world was coming undone. In that moment, it was as if the road itself was a living entity, pulling at him, reaching for him, determined to claim him as its own. And then the world went black. It began on an ordinary morning, just like any other. The sun crept over the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the city. Birds chirped in the distance, and the air was cool, a welcome reprieve from the stifling heat of the previous days. Sophie had just finished her morning coffee when the first reports came in. A strange illness, one that had no known origin, was spreading quickly. People were falling ill, feverish, disoriented, violent. At first, the authorities chalked it up to an outbreak of something seasonal. They always did. But within hours, it became clear that this was no ordinary infection. Sophie heard the first screams outside her apartment window. The sound was sharp and frantic, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. She stood frozen, holding her coffee mug, staring out into the street. A figure appeared in the middle of the road, stumbling and dragging one leg. It was disheveled, with torn clothing and pale skin stretched tight over its bones. It moved erratically, like a broken puppet being jerked around by invisible strings. And then it lunged. Sophie's heart stopped as she watched the figure sink its teeth into a passing pedestrian, who collapsed to the ground with a cry of agony. The pedestrian's body twitched, jerked violently, and then stood back up, now just like the thing that had attacked it. The infected, no longer human, were here. Her apartment became a prison. Sophie slammed the window shut, locking the door behind her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she snatched it up, frantically texting her friends and family. But all the messages were the same: chaos, panic. The government had declared martial law, but it was too late. Minutes later, the power went out. Darkness filled the apartment, the hum of the city outside now replaced by a strange silence, broken only by the occasional distant scream. Sophie tried to breathe through the panic swelling in her chest. A loud banging at the door broke through her thoughts. She froze, her hand on the doorknob, heart pounding in her ears. The banging came again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural moan. Sophie's blood ran cold. She could hear them now, shuffling, scraping noises outside. The zombies. She backed away from the door, her breath shallow. She could hear voices in the hallway, low whispers, desperate cries. Someone was trapped out there. Someone was being hunted. The pounding on her door began again, relentless. Sophie didn't know how long she had until they broke through. She had to make a decision. Would she risk the unknown, opening the door to try to escape? Or would she hunker down and wait, hoping that somehow, against all odds, help would come? But as the pounding grew louder, as the terrifying sound of breaking wood reached her ears, she knew there was no waiting. No one was coming. Not now. The door splintered with a sharp crack, and Sophie turned, sprinting toward the back of the apartment. The only way out was through the fire escape. But just as her hand reached the door, she heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps behind her. It was too late. Sophie's breath came in ragged gasps as she twisted the fire escape's rusty handle. It wouldn't budge. Her pulse hammered in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears. Behind her, the door shattered open, splinters flying across the floor. She heard their growls, guttural and low, like a distant animal that had forgotten how to speak. Panic surged, but Sophie forced herself to remain focused. She slammed her shoulder against the door to the fire escape once more. The hinges groaned, but this time, the door creaked open enough for her to squeeze through. She burst into the narrow alleyway, the morning sun now a faint memory beneath the oppressive, gray clouds that loomed overhead. The air felt thick with the weight of the unknown, and Sophie's senses were alive with fear. Every noise seemed amplified, the sound of her feet pounding against the pavement, the distant screams, and the echoes of the undead as they shuffled in pursuit. She didn't dare look back. The alley seemed endless, walls looming on either side. She could hear the low moans of the infected growing louder with every step, a chorus of death trailing her. Her legs burned, her breath ragged and unsteady. She had to keep moving. She had no choice. Ahead, she saw a flicker of movement, a shadow darting between the buildings. The person? No, it couldn't be. Everyone was dead. But there it was again, just a glimpse. Her heart skipped a beat. The city had become a graveyard, but somewhere, someone was still alive. Sophie veered toward the movement, her pulse quickening. She rounded a corner and found herself in a narrow street lined with abandoned cars. A man stood in front of a broken storefront, his back to her. He didn't seem to notice her approach, his focus on the wreckage scattered around him. "Hey!" Sophie called out, her voice hoarse from the dry air and terror. The man turned, eyes wide with a mixture of relief and disbelief. His clothes were torn, blood-stained, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. A shotgun was slung across his back, and he held a large backpack tightly in one hand, but he didn't seem ready to make any move toward her. "You're not one of them?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling as she took cautious steps closer. He studied her for a moment, eyes narrowing, before he nodded slowly. "No, not yet, anyway." Sophie didn't understand. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned toward the door of the shop behind him. "Come inside. It's not safe out here." Without hesitation, Sophie nodded, her heart still pounding in her chest, but she didn't care. She didn't want to be out here alone anymore. She followed him quickly, glancing over her shoulder to make sure she wasn't being followed. The man opened the door, leading her into the dark interior of the building. The air inside was stale and smelled faintly of mold. The glass of the front windows was shattered, and the space was eerily quiet, the only sound their footsteps on the broken floor tiles. "I'm Max," the man said, his voice low. He gave her a brief, calculating glance. "What's your name?" "Sophie," she replied, trying to steady her breath. "Are there more of you? People alive, I mean?" Max looked away for a moment, the weight of unspoken words heavy in the silence. "A few," he muttered, "but not many. It's a matter of time." Sophie felt a chill spread through her at the cold finality of his words. It was true. They were all doomed. There was no escape. The infection spread faster than anyone had anticipated, overwhelming the hospitals and the military. The world as she knew it was gone. Max's eyes softened as he noticed her discomfort. "Hey, don't get like that. We're not dead yet, all right?" But Sophie wasn't sure. She had seen it in the streets, how fast the infection took hold, how quickly it turned people into ravenous beasts. How long before it reached them? How long before she too was overwhelmed by the hunger? She clenched her fists, feeling the gnawing terror twist in her gut. "You look like you've been running for a while," Max said, interrupting her thoughts. "But you don't have a group?" Sophie shook her head. "I was alone when it started. I've been trying to get to my sister's house, but..." She paused, biting back the lump in her throat. The image of her sister's face, smiling at her the night before the outbreak, felt like a lifetime ago. Sophie had tried, she had tried to get to her. But the streets had become a war zone. There had been no way. Max gave her a solemn look. Everyone's trying to get to someone, but nobody gets there. The silence hung between them, thick with the weight of the harsh reality. Sophie rubbed her arms, trying to fight the cold, the dread that had taken root deep inside her. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from outside. Sophie jumped, heart racing. The sound was followed by another, and then another. Something, or someone, was pounding against the walls of the building. The moans of the infected grew louder, closer. Max cursed under his breath, reaching for the shotgun on his back. "We don't have much time," he muttered. "Grab whatever you can. We're leaving." Sophie's mind raced. She had no choice. She could either sit here and wait for the inevitable or try to fight for her life. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the room, searching for anything that could help her survive. She found a crowbar in the corner, dusty and abandoned. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Max looked at her, then to the door. "Get ready." She nodded, her grip tight around the crowbar. The pounding grew louder, relentless. Someone was at the door, pushing against it, desperate to get in. The door was going to give way. They didn't have much time left. The sound of the door groaning under pressure sent a sharp jolt of adrenaline through Sophie. Her grip on the crowbar tightened. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do, swing it, block the door, or run, but the cold realization was sinking in. There was no escape without a fight. Max was already at the window, peering through the shattered glass, his hand gripping the shotgun tightly. His eyes flicked back to Sophie, dark with urgency. "They're getting closer," Max muttered, his voice low and strained. "We have to move." "No." Sophie didn't hesitate. She looked around, scanning the darkened room for anything she could use. The shelves were toppled over, remnants of abandoned lives scattered across the floor, books, broken furniture, and empty food containers. Nothing seemed useful, nothing would save them, but still, her mind raced. Another crash, louder this time, as the door's hinges gave way. The first of the infected, pale, twisted, and bloodied, tumbled into the building. It was a woman, or had been once. Her face was a grotesque mockery of life, skin peeling in jagged sheets, her eyes vacant and wide, pupils just black holes. She let out a shrill, guttural scream that sent a ripple of panic through Sophie. "Sophie, behind you!" Max shouted. Sophie swung her crowbar at the woman, connecting with the side of her head. The blow sent a sickening crunch through the air, but it didn't stop the infected. It just staggered her for a moment before she lurched forward again, mouth open wide, desperate to tear into flesh. Max fired. The blast shattered the silence, and the infected woman collapsed into a heap, blood and viscera splattering across the floor. The shotgun's recoil left Max briefly unsteady, but he wasted no time. "We've got to go." Now, the room was filled with the sounds of other bodies crashing through the door, more infected pouring in from the alley, their shrieks growing louder by the second. Sophie's heart hammered in her chest, and she darted past the dead woman, following Max to the back of the store. He didn't stop, didn't pause for a second to think about what might be behind the door he was pushing open. It led to a narrow hallway that ran to the back of the building. Another door, a metal one this time, stood at the end of the hall. It was a second exit, an emergency escape. Sophie's legs burned from the sprint, but she couldn't let her fear take hold. Max was ahead of her, opening the metal door with a snap, his face tight with concentration. They were almost there. Almost. Another scream shattered the moment. Sophie turned to see two more infected stumbling down the hall toward them, their movements jerky and unnatural. They looked like they had been torn apart and put back together in the wrong order. One of them had half a face, its lower jaw hanging at an odd angle, yet it still managed to lunge toward her with terrifying speed. Max turned, firing again. But the blast went wide. The infected kept coming. Sophie's pulse spiked. She was so close, but they were closing in, the sound of their footsteps echoing like death on their heels. Max shoved her forward. "Go," he barked. Sophie stumbled, her chest tight with panic. She didn't want to die here. Not like this. Not in a hallway with the stench of death closing in around her. She pushed through the door behind Max, her heart pounding in her ears, but it was too late. The door slammed shut behind her with a sickening thud, and the moment the latch caught, she heard the clawing, scraping of the infected outside. They were trying to break through. Max turned to her, sweat dripping down his face, his breath heavy. "We have a moment. Just a moment." Sophie took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. They had to keep moving, there was no time for hesitation. Behind them, the hallway extended into a small courtyard, overgrown with weeds and littered with the bones of the past. The air was thick with the stench of decay. The courtyard was their last chance. "There's a truck outside," Max said, pointing to the overgrown lot. "If we can make it there, we can leave." Sophie nodded, but something gnawed at her. The air felt wrong, heavier somehow. She could hear something more than the growls and moans of the infected. "Max," Sophie's voice faltered as she peered around, but before she could finish, she froze. The courtyard was no longer empty. Figures emerged from the shadows, their grotesque forms swaying with unnatural grace. These weren't like the others, the ones who had once been human and mindlessly shambled toward them. No, these were different. They were fast, controlled, as though something was guiding them. They moved like predators, like animals that had learned how to hunt. Max raised his shotgun, eyes widening in shock. "What the hell? Get back!" Sophie screamed, pulling him by the sleeve, trying to drag him away from the courtyard. But it was too late. The new infected closed in, encircling them, cutting off any escape route. Sophie's heart pounded as she realized that the figures weren't just infected, they were hunters. They were something worse. A shrill voice echoed in the distance, high-pitched and almost human, but distorted in a way that made Sophie's skin crawl. It was a sound like laughter, a twisted version of it, growing louder. The figures stopped in their tracks, their heads tilting, almost as if waiting for something. Or someone. Max shot, and the blast rang out across the courtyard, but it barely fazed them. Sophie barely registered the sound, her mind racing. The hunters weren't stopping. They were coming closer. There was only one choice left. She turned to Max, her eyes wide with desperation. "We need to run." Max's face was grim, but he didn't hesitate. "On 3, he said. The last dawn, par 4. Max's finger tightened around the trigger of the shotgun, the cold metal slick in his grip, but his hand was shaking. Sophie could see it, could feel the terror pulsing in the air. The infected hunters didn't move, not yet. They only watched, their hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light, their movements eerily still, as though they were toying with them. Sophie's pulse raced, the blood pounding in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't, not without Max. Not with these monsters standing between them and any chance of survival. "On 3, Max said again, his voice low but steady. Sophie nodded, her fingers wrapping tighter around the crowbar. The hunters were too close now. She could hear their heavy, labored breaths, could smell the rot that clung to them. There was no time to waste. They had to act. 1, Max's voice barely reached her over the sound of her heart, but it was enough. Sophie's grip tightened around the crowbar. She was ready. 2, the space between them and the hunters closed, the figures closing in from all directions. Sophie felt the heat of their presence, the weight of their hunger hanging in the air. She could almost feel their breath on her skin. And then Max moved. 3. He fired, the shotgun's blast deafening in the confined space. The force of the shot knocked one of the hunters off its feet, its body crumpling into the dirt with a sickening thud. But the others didn't hesitate. They charged. Sophie swung the crowbar with everything she had, the metal connecting with the face of one of the hunters. It stumbled back, but not far enough. Sophie swung again, hitting it in the ribs, the sickening crack of bone and the wet thud of impact echoing around the courtyard. But the creature didn't slow. It snarled, its face twisted in pain and rage, its hands reaching for her with unnerving speed. Max was beside her now, swinging the shotgun like a club, smashing it into another hunter's skull. The crack of bone filled the air, but the creature didn't fall. It turned on him, slashing at his chest with its claw-like hands, leaving deep gouges in his shirt and skin. "Max!" Sophie screamed. She didn't think. She acted. She lunged forward, swinging the crowbar in a wide arc. The metal connected with the hunter's head, and this time it crumpled. Sophie didn't wait to see if it was truly dead. She spun, her eyes scanning the courtyard for more. The remaining hunters were circling them now, their movements more deliberate, as though they were assessing their prey. Sophie's chest tightened, panic threatening to overtake her, but she forced it down. She couldn't afford to lose control. Max's voice broke through the chaos, hoarse and frantic. "We need to get to the truck. Now." Sophie looked toward the overgrown lot. The truck was still there, its rusty form barely visible in the dim light, but the path was blocked. The hunters were closing in from all sides, their eyes gleaming with hunger. "Max!" Sophie shouted. "Cover me!" Without waiting for a response, she darted forward, her legs pumping beneath her as she sprinted toward the truck. She could hear Max behind her, his shotgun barking again, but the sound was distant, muffled by the ringing in her ears. One of the hunters lunged at her from the left, its claws swiping through the air with terrifying speed. Sophie barely managed to duck, feeling the air move as the claws missed by inches. She kept running, pushing her body harder than it had ever gone before. The truck was closer now, just a few steps away. She could see Max ahead of her, still fighting off the attackers. He was moving with desperate precision, each shot a warning to the others. But it was too much. Too many. Sophie reached the truck's bed, scrambling up onto it with shaking hands. She turned, her eyes scanning the courtyard for Max. He was still fighting, his back to her, his face a mask of determination. But there were too many. "Max!" Sophie screamed again, panic clawing at her throat. "We can't fight them all. We need to go." Max didn't answer. He didn't turn. He just kept fighting, his every movement a blur of violence. Sophie felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. She couldn't just leave him, but she couldn't let herself die here either. Another hunter lunged at Max, its sharp claws finding purchase in his arm. He staggered back, but his resolve didn't falter. He shot point blank, and the creature's head exploded in a spray of blood and bone. But more kept coming. They never stopped. Sophie's heart raced, her breath shallow. The truck was her only chance, but Max was still out there. He was fighting, still giving it everything he had, but there was only so much one person could do. He wasn't invincible. He couldn't hold them all back forever. She made a choice. "Hold on," Sophie shouted, her voice barely reaching him over the chaos. She grabbed the truck's keys from her pocket, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the ignition. The engine roared to life, shaking the truck's frame with a low growl. "Max," she screamed again, but her voice faltered. She couldn't wait any longer. She couldn't. She slammed the truck in gear and tore out of the lot, the wheels spinning in the dirt, kicking up rocks and debris as the vehicle lurched forward. Sophie didn't look back. She couldn't. But the screams of the hunters echoed in the distance, fading as she drove, knowing they would not stop until they had her. They never stopped. Sophie's grip on the steering wheel tightened as the truck barreled down the abandoned highway. The engine roared, drowning out everything else, the gnashing of teeth, the screams of the undead, the whispers of her own doubts. She didn't dare glance in the rearview mirror. The darkness pressing in from all sides was enough to make her heart race. Max was still out there, somewhere. The thought gnawed at her. She should have waited. She should have tried harder. But the truth was, Sophie wasn't sure if waiting would have made any difference. The infected were too fast, too relentless. And now, with each mile between her and the hell she left behind, a sense of guilt twisted in her gut. She pushed the truck harder, the tires skidding against the cracked asphalt. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, but it offered no comfort. Nothing felt safe anymore. There were no guarantees. The sky above was a sickly orange hue, the sun setting on a world that no longer made sense. Sophie had seen the city burn, watched it fall to ruin. People screamed in the streets, while the infected tore through every corner of the city like locusts. She had been one of the lucky ones, surviving by sheer willpower and dumb luck. But now she was alone. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the radio, scanning for any sign of life, any hint that someone else was out there. The static buzzed, then crackled with faint voices. "This is Redstone Outpost. If anyone can hear this, we are taking survivors. We have supplies. We have shelter. Repeat, Redstone Outpost is accepting survivors. Please respond." Sophie's pulse quickened. A fleeting thread of hope. Her fingers flew to the mic, but the words caught in her throat. What was she supposed to say? She couldn't just tell them her name, her story. Not now, not when there was still so much uncertainty. Instead, she let out a shaky breath and pressed the button. "This is Sophie. I'm on my way." She didn't know if they heard her, but she had to believe they did. They had to. The truck rumbled onward, the tires kicking up dirt as the landscape outside became more desolate with each passing minute. Abandoned cars littered the roadside, some burnt-out husks, others overturned, their windows shattered. A new kind of silence had fallen over the world. The kind that made you question whether anything, or anyone, was left to save. It wasn't long before Sophie heard something strange, a distant sound, like a rhythmic thudding. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but the sound grew louder and closer. Her heart skipped a beat as her foot slammed on the brake, the truck screeching to a halt in the middle of the road. She threw the gear into park and jumped out, the cool air rushing over her as she scanned the horizon. The thudding wasn't a trick of her mind. It was a group of infected, several of them moving in her direction with that familiar, unholy urgency. They were running, not stumbling or dragging themselves as the others usually did. These were the hunters, the ones with the speed and ferocity to tear through anything in their path. They were coming for her. She dove back into the truck, slamming the door shut, her hands fumbling for the gear shift. Her foot slammed back down on the accelerator, but she wasn't fast enough. They were almost on her. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't have much time. There was no way she could outrun them. The truck's engine roared, but it wasn't enough. The first one reached the vehicle, slamming its body against the side with a sickening thud. Sophie gasped, her fingers gripping the wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. The truck lurched forward, but the infected didn't stop. One of them clawed at the side window, the glass cracking under its sharp, rotting nails. Sophie slammed the wheel to the right, sending the truck careening off the road and into the overgrown grass. The infected stumbled behind her, but they were too fast. Too hungry. Max's face flashed in her mind again, his battered form fighting off the creatures, his voice screaming for her to go. She had failed him. She had left him behind. She couldn't think like that. She couldn't let the guilt drag her down. Her foot slammed the accelerator once more, but the truck was struggling, the wheels spinning on the uneven ground. She could feel the creatures gaining on her, their snarls growing louder with each passing second. Ahead, the faint silhouette of a structure appeared, Redstone Outpost. Sophie's heart skipped. Could she make it? Could she survive long enough to reach the outpost, to find safety? Or was this just another illusion, another fleeting hope that would fade before she could reach it? The truck's engine sputtered, and Sophie cursed. The vehicle had taken too much damage. She could hear the clunking from the rear axle as the suspension gave way. There was no way she would make it without a miracle. She had one chance. The hunter lunged at the truck's door, its rotted fingers scraping the metal, and Sophie saw the rest of them closing in from all sides. She slammed the gear shift into reverse, jerking the truck backward as the undead slammed against it from all sides. She had to go. With a scream of fury, Sophie wrenched the wheel and floored the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, but she wasn't driving. Not anymore. She was running. As the world outside blurred, Sophie didn't look back. Not yet. Sophie pushed the truck as hard as it would go, the engine roaring with desperate power, but it was clear that she wasn't in control anymore. The road was slipping away beneath her, swallowed by the darkness. The once vibrant landscape had turned into a gray, twisted version of itself, everything coated in a sickly, unnatural hue. The headlights barely pierced the gloom, and the shadows seemed to writhe and crawl in every corner of her vision. Redstone Outpost was just ahead, or so she hoped. Her eyes darted back to the rearview mirror, no sign of the hunters yet, but she could hear them. The thudding, the growls, they were relentless. If she couldn't make it to the outpost, then what? Her pulse raced. Her grip on the wheel was slick with sweat. She could hear her breath coming in ragged bursts, feel the panic rising in her throat like a choking weight. She glanced at the fuel gauge. Near empty. Ahead, the outpost loomed, a dilapidated structure standing like a dark sentinel against the dying light. The walls were broken, some windows shattered, but it was still standing. Still a sign of life, even if it was barely hanging on. The words on the rusted sign, barely legible now, spelled the hope she desperately clung to, Redstone Outpost. The truck hit a bump, jolting Sophie, but she kept her focus. This was it. She had to reach it no matter what. Her hands trembled, slipping slightly off the steering wheel. She willed herself to stay calm, to not look behind her, to focus on the narrow stretch of road that would lead her to the gates of whatever safety the outpost might hold. Then it happened. The truck sputtered, a violent jolt, followed by a sickening grinding noise. The engine stalled. Shit! Sophie screamed, desperately cranking the ignition, but the truck refused to start. The empty tank mocked her with its silence. She couldn't believe it. She was so close to salvation. The growls grew louder, closer, and Sophie's pulse shot up. Her breath was coming faster now, heart slamming against her chest like a drumbeat. She slammed the gear shift into park, unbuckled her seatbelt, and threw open the door. No time to waste. She didn't look back. Sophie bolted from the truck, the cold night air biting at her skin. The dry, cracked ground scraped against her boots as she ran. The outpost's gates were only 100 yards away, but it felt like a mile. Her legs burned, every step a battle, but the sounds of the hunters, guttural, horrible, drove her forward, the instinct to survive overriding everything else. With every step, the ground seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. She didn't dare look back. Her heart was pounding in her throat, her breath ragged, but she could see the shape of the outpost gates ahead. Just a little further. She reached them. The gates were partially open, the heavy metal doors ajar just enough for her to squeeze through. She threw herself through the gap, her shoulders scraping the side of the doorframe as she tumbled to the ground inside the compound. She pushed herself up, gasping for air, and looked around. The outpost was eerily silent. Abandoned, it seemed. The structures were dilapidated, like everything else, but the lights, faint but steady, flickered in the distance, casting shadows on the walls of the central building. Sophie's hand shot to the gate, pulling it shut as quietly as she could. She felt a surge of relief. She was inside. She was safe for now. But the relief was short-lived. The moment the gate clicked into place, a loud, bone-chilling scream echoed from the dark outside. The infected were close. Too close. She turned to face the building. "Hello," she shouted, her voice rough, filled with desperation. "Anyone here? I need help." Nothing. She didn't wait for an answer. She ran toward the nearest building, her footfalls echoing in the silence. The interior was dark, filled with rusted furniture and broken windows. Abandoned. A sudden movement at the far end of the hallway made her freeze. Someone was there. "Who's there?" Sophie demanded, her voice trembling. A figure stepped out of the shadows. A man, tall, gaunt, with a wild, untamed beard and piercing eyes. He looked at her without speaking, his expression unreadable. "I'm Sophie," she said, breathing hard. "I'm a survivor. I need help. I've been running for days. There are more out there." The man's gaze flicked behind her, to the gates. Then he nodded slightly. "We've all been running for days." His voice was low, hoarse. "And there's nothing left to help you." Sophie's heart sank. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her. "You're not safe here." "No one is." "Not anymore." Sophie recoiled, her blood running cold. "What do you mean?" He looked at her, eyes filled with something darker than the shadows around them. "You think the infected are the worst of it?" He chuckled, a hollow, mirthless sound. "You haven't seen anything yet?" The lights flickered, then went out. The hallway was plunged into darkness. Sophie's breath hitched. She felt the panic rise again. She spun, but before she could run, she heard it, the sound of the infected outside, clawing at the gates. The gates. She had forgotten to lock them properly. And then, from the shadows, she heard a voice. A voice she hadn't heard in days. "Help me, Sophie." She froze. The voice was faint, broken, but unmistakable. Sophie's chest constricted. Was it really him? Had he made it? Her pulse raced as she turned back toward the darkness. But the man, the stranger, grabbed her arm. "No," he whispered urgently. "It's too late." Sophie shook her head, struggling against his grip. "Let go of me. I have to help him. It's Max." The man's face twisted into something grotesque, almost inhuman. "You don't understand. You don't get it. He's not Max. He's not anyone anymore." Sophie screamed, wrenching herself free. She darted down the hallway, driven by the sound of that voice, even though her mind screamed at her to stop. She reached the door at the end, the heavy wooden door creaking open as she shoved it aside. There, in the center of the room, was Max, or what was left of him. His face was covered in blood, his body grotesquely twisted, a terrible, unnatural mockery of the person he once was. He was alive, but not in the way she had hoped. His eyes were vacant, empty. "Sophie," the word was a rasp, his lips trembling. She ran to him, but as she did, something inside her shifted. She realized, with sickening clarity, that there was no escape. No safety. No redemption. Max reached for her, his rotting hands grabbing at her. She tried to pull away, but it was too late. The infection had taken root too deeply. He was one of them now. With a sob, Sophie backed away, but there was no place to run. The walls of Redstone Outpost seemed to close in on her. And in the dark, she realized the truth. There was no hope left.
The town of Willow Creek had always been a quiet place, nestled in a forgotten corner of the world, far from the chaos of city life. Few people passed through and even fewer stayed. It wasn't much to look at. A handful of old brick buildings, faded storefronts, and winding streets that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. But something about it had a pull, a quiet, subtle tug on the soul that made those who came through feel uneasy, as if they didn't belong. One night, in the early hours when the town was hidden in the embrace of darkness, a car appeared on the road that led out of the valley. It was an old sedan, its headlights cutting through the thick fog that rolled over the asphalt. The tires crunched over the gravel as the car slowly made its way toward the center of town. The driver, a man named Jack, having no idea where he was. Jack had been driving for hours, or perhaps days. Time had started to blur into something indiscernible. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but the road kept pulling him forward. It was as if something was guiding him, forcing him to continue even though every fiber of his being screamed for him to stop. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white, but his mind kept slipping, like a fog that refused to lift. The town was eerily silent as Jack entered. Not a single light was on in the buildings. No dogs barking, no rustling of trees in the breeze. Just the steady hum of his engine and the soft swish of the wipers pushing the fog away. He passed an old, weathered gas station on the outskirts, the flickering neon sign casting a faint, sickly glow over the deserted lot. The sign was broken, half of the letters missing, but it still seemed to beckon him to stop. But Jack couldn't bring himself to do it. He needed to get out, needed to keep driving, but something had changed. The road ahead felt different now, as if it had become something else entirely. Something that didn't lead anywhere at all. The fog thickened, rolling over the car like a blanket. The world outside the windows became a blur, indistinguishable from the darkness itself. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the car's headlights flickered and went out. Jack slammed on the brakes, heart pounding, but the car continued to coast forward, gliding silently through the night. He cursed under his breath, trying to restart the engine, but the car refused to respond. A sharp sound echoed from somewhere in the distance. A crack, sharp and unnatural, breaking the silence. Jack's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but all he saw was a wall of fog. No other cars, no figures moving in the distance. Just the swirling, oppressive mist that seemed to swallow everything. He reached for the door handle, but before he could open it, something caught his eye. A figure, standing in the middle of the road. Its shape was indistinct, shifting in and out of the fog, as if it were both there and not. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that stretched and twisted like branches of an ancient tree. Jack froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, staring back at him with hollow eyes. He tried to start the car again, but the engine sputtered, and then nothing. The figure seemed to shift, as though it was aware of his panic. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, and then another, its long, impossibly thin arms hanging by its sides like ropes. Jack's heart raced in his chest. Sweat clung to his palms as he fumbled with the door handle, desperate to escape. But before he could react, a low, guttural voice filled the air. A whisper that sounded like it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You shouldn't have come here." Jack's blood ran cold. The words seemed to echo in his head, reverberating through the fog and the stillness of the town. Without thinking, he threw open the door and bolted from the car, the cold air biting at his skin. His feet pounded the pavement as he ran, the sound of his footsteps drowned by the oppressive silence around him. He didn't dare look back. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance between himself and whatever that thing was. But the town, it was different. The buildings were gone now, replaced by walls of black, featureless stone that stretched up into the sky, blocking any escape. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The whisper followed him, growing louder, closer. "You shouldn't have come here." Jack's mind raced. He needed to escape, needed to wake up from this nightmare. But it was as if the town itself had swallowed him whole. And then, he heard it. A low, scraping sound coming from behind him. Something dragging along the ground. He dared a glance over his shoulder. The figure was closer now, its limbs moving in unnatural, jerking motions, like a puppet on strings. It was almost within reach. Jack could hear the whispers growing louder, hear the breath of the thing that stalked him, feel its presence creeping closer. His legs burned with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. And then, just when he thought he couldn't run any longer, the ground beneath his feet gave way. His foot slipped, and he tumbled into the darkness below, landing hard on something cold and unyielding. The air around him was thick with a suffocating, damp smell. He gasped for breath, struggling to stand, but the ground seemed to shift beneath him. It was like he was no longer on solid ground, as if the world itself had tilted sideways. Jack's eyes strained to adjust to the dim light, but the darkness was endless. The walls around him seemed to pulse with a strange energy, like they were alive, watching him. And then, in the distance, he heard something else. A soft, melodic sound, like the ringing of a bell, followed by a whisper that chilled him to his core. "Welcome to the town of the lost." Jack froze. The whisper echoed in his ears, a faint, haunting melody. Somewhere, far off in the distance, something stirred, and in the stillness of the void, Jack understood the truth. He was never leaving. Jack's heart raced as the sound of the bell grew louder, closer. His feet shuffled over the uneven ground, the sensation beneath him growing more and more unnatural. Every step he took felt like walking on something that wasn't solid, like the earth itself had become soft and unstable, shifting beneath his weight. The whispering, too, had grown more intense, no longer just a distant sound. It surrounded him, coming from all directions. Each voice was indistinguishable from the other, speaking in a language he couldn't understand, but he felt its weight in his chest, pressing down on him. "Welcome to the town of the lost," the voice repeated, now clearer, as if someone or something had been waiting for him to hear it. The tone was neither welcoming nor threatening, but something in the cadence made his stomach churn. The darkness around him was suffocating, and his breath came in ragged gasps. As he stumbled forward, he noticed a faint glow flickering in the distance, like a candle's flame struggling against the oppressive blackness. It was his only point of reference. Desperate for any sign of life, or even hope, Jack forced himself to move toward it. The air grew colder as he approached the glow, and the whispers intensified, now almost overlapping each other in a cacophony of murmurs. Every step felt heavier than the last. The closer he got, the more the voices seemed to press in on him, as though the very air was alive with them. When Jack finally reached the source of the light, he found himself standing at the edge of a long corridor, walls stretching upwards into infinity. The glow came from small, flickering lanterns placed at even intervals along the passage. But the deeper he looked, the more it became clear that these weren't mere lanterns. The light was coming from eyes, hundreds of them, thousands, eyes that blinked, stared, and turned to follow his movements. Jack's breath hitched, and he instinctively took a step back. His mind screamed at him to turn around and run, but his body wouldn't obey. The eyes were not just watching him, they were waiting, and in some way Jack knew they had always been here, watching the lost souls who passed through this place. A figure emerged from the darkness ahead. At first, Jack thought it was just another illusion, a trick of the mind, but as it drew closer, he could see the figure more clearly. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, elongated limbs that twisted unnaturally. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face was featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, blank surface. The figure stood in front of him now, towering above him, and Jack could feel a coldness radiating from it. The whispers ceased abruptly, as if they were waiting for something. Jack opened his mouth to scream, to ask what this place was, to beg for answers, but no sound came. It was as if the air itself had stolen his voice. The figure reached out, its long fingers extending toward him, moving with an eerie fluidity. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but his legs refused to move. He couldn't escape. He couldn't breathe. The fingers brushed lightly against his face, cold and clammy. And in that moment, Jack felt an overwhelming wave of despair crash over him. It wasn't physical pain. It was something deeper, something that reached into his soul. His entire existence felt insignificant, as if he had always belonged here, in this place of lost souls. And then, the figure's mouth opened, stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Jack could hear the sound of a faint, guttural growl emanating from within, and the air seemed to vibrate with a low hum that made his teeth ache. The figure spoke, its voice both distant and intimate, reverberating through Jack's mind, his very bones. "You've crossed into the realm of the forgotten," it said, its voice a twisted echo of something ancient and untouchable. "There is no escape. There never was." Before Jack could even comprehend the words, the creature's hand closed around his throat. His body went limp as the coldness filled him entirely, his vision blurring. But even as his consciousness began to fade, he could feel the weight of the eyes, the thousands of eyes all upon him. And then, everything went silent. There was no more darkness, no more whispers, no more figure. For a long time, Jack floated in nothingness, unable to move, unable to think, as if he were a part of the very air, suspended between life and death. Then, finally, the silence was broken. A voice, soft, distant, yet so very clear, spoke from somewhere, far away but close enough to pierce through the void. "You are here now." The words lingered in Jack's mind like a slow-burning ember, the tone chilling yet oddly familiar. It wasn't the voice of the figure. This voice felt older, more fragmented, more like a memory that was trying to break through. Something deep within him stirred, but he couldn't grasp it. His entire being felt detached, as if his body were a distant echo of itself. "You have always been here," the voice continued, growing clearer with each word. "You are part of this place now. The forgotten, the lost." Jack wanted to scream. He wanted to break free from this suffocating emptiness. But there was no air to fill his lungs, no body to command. His consciousness, if he could even call it that, hung suspended in an inescapable void. Then, without warning, the world around him shifted. It wasn't like opening his eyes. It was more like a crack in the fabric of reality had been forced open. Jagged and distorted, the space around him stretched and twisted in unnatural shapes. And then, he was no longer floating. Jack's feet were on solid ground again, though the sensation felt wrong. The ground was slick, not from rain or snow, but from something much darker, much older. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and a faint, haunting melody echoed through the suffocating silence, coming from nowhere yet everywhere at once. It was then that Jack saw it. A figure, human in shape but not quite right. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin a sickly, translucent gray that seemed to shimmer under the faint, flickering lights above. Its head tilted at an odd angle, the neck bending at an impossible curve, and though it had eyes, they were not eyes in the way Jack understood them. The pupils were too large, too dark, swallowing the light around them, making it impossible to tell where the figure began and where the shadows ended. For a moment, Jack stood frozen, paralyzed by the grotesque sight. Then the figure moved toward him, its steps silent but deliberate, as if it was in no hurry. Its elongated fingers twitched slightly as it reached out, the shadows around it seeming to pulse with a life of their own. Jack tried to back away, but his body moved sluggishly, like wading through thick tar. His legs wouldn't cooperate, and as much as he screamed in his mind, no sound escaped his lips. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a painful reminder of his helplessness. "You've crossed into a place that feeds on memories," the figure spoke, its voice a low rasp that reverberated through Jack's bones. "The memories of those who were too lost to leave. Those who wandered too far and forgot who they were." The words echoed through Jack's mind, and suddenly, flashes of his life. The life he thought he had left behind. flooded his consciousness. His name, his childhood, his family, his friends. They all came rushing back to him in an overwhelming wave, but they were not his memories anymore. They were twisted, distorted. Faces became unrecognizable. Events warped into something unholy. Jack tried to scream, but the air had thickened to the point where it was impossible to breathe, much less speak. The figure stepped closer, and Jack could feel its presence pressing in on him, suffocating him. All of this place is built on the fragments of the forgotten, the figure continued. You're just another piece, Jack. You've always been part of it. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing against Jack's arm. Cold seeped into his skin like ice, and with it came a flood of visions, flashes of memories that weren't his. They were from others who had passed through this place, their lives slipping away into the dark corners of this forgotten realm. Jack's mind fractured under the weight of it all. Faces, names, and places twisted into grotesque parodies of what they once were. He couldn't tell if the memories were his own anymore, or if they ever had been. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air that wasn't there. The world around him began to distort once more, the ground beneath him shifting like water, and the shadows pressed in from every side, their forms warping into grotesque shapes that writhed and twisted. The figure moved closer, its shadow swallowing Jack whole. "We are all forgotten here," it whispered, its voice no longer coming from its lips but from every corner of the void. "You'll join us soon, Jack, just like the others." Lost and forgotten, the last thing Jack saw before his vision blurred and his consciousness slipped away was the figure's eyes. Endless, dark, and consuming, pulling him into the abyss. Jack's senses faded slowly, like the final moments of a dream slipping away at the break of dawn. His body, now entirely numb, felt like it no longer belonged to him. But his mind was still there, anchored somewhere in the void, desperately clinging to something real. Time ceased to exist. The concept of it was gone, shredded by the overwhelming presence of the figure and the nightmare of memories that flooded his thoughts. He wasn't sure how long he had been trapped in this place, or if he had even been here for more than a few moments. The air, thick and suffocating, clung to his skin like oil, and the weight of the darkness pushed against him, a constant pressure that made him feel as if he were being crushed from all sides. The place, the forgotten realm, as the figure had called it, seemed to stretch on infinitely, no boundaries, no edges, just an endless expanse of nothing. The flickering lights that hung above him, though dim, were always present, casting harsh shadows that seemed to reach for him with each step he took. He tried to stand, but the ground beneath him was no longer solid. It pulsed, like a living thing, sending vibrations through his bones. His movements were sluggish, as if his body was weighed down by the air itself. He looked around, but there was no sign of the figure anymore. No sound except the distant hum of something that felt almost like a heartbeat. The memories were getting louder now. Each flash was sharper, more vivid, pulling him deeper into the web. He could hear the voices, the ones that came with the images, whispering to him, telling him things he couldn't understand. They were unfamiliar, yet there was a sickening familiarity in their tone, like voices he had once known but had long since forgotten. The ground beneath Jack trembled again, and his gaze snapped up. The darkness seemed to shift, a ripple passing through it like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. And then movement. A figure emerged from the shadows. This time it wasn't the same creature. No, this was something different, something even worse. The figure was human, but it was wrong in ways that Jack couldn't fully comprehend. Its face was hollow, its features distorted beyond recognition, as if someone had tried to carve a face out of clay but had stopped halfway. Its skin was translucent, stretched thin, almost like it was just a layer of film over its bones, and its eyes, they were wide, far too wide, and full of an unnatural emptiness. The thing stepped forward, its body jerking in unnatural angles as it moved closer to Jack. There was no grace to its movement, only the erratic, frantic twitch of something desperate. Jack tried to move, to run, but his legs felt like lead, his body refusing to obey. It was as though the figure was pulling at him, draining him of his will. It stopped just in front of him, its hollow gaze fixed directly on Jack. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but silence, an oppressive stillness that suffocated him more than any noise ever could. The thing tilted its head, and Jack could hear the faintest whisper of a voice, one that sounded like the faintest memory of something once heard. "Join us." The words slithered into his mind, coiling around his thoughts like a snake, burrowing deep into his consciousness. Jack fought against it, fought against the invasive presence, but it was too late. The words were in him now, gnawing at him, tearing apart any resistance. The creature reached out with its long, skeletal hand, and Jack felt an overwhelming urge to let it touch him. He didn't know why, he couldn't explain it, but the pull was too strong. It was like a deep, insatiable hunger that he could not ignore. The touch was cold, ice cold. It seeped into his skin, into his veins, and Jack could feel something change inside him. His thoughts began to blur, his sense of self crumbling away as the figure's presence took over, filling him with an unbearable sense of wrongness. "You will never leave," the thing hissed, its voice now a cacophony of whispers that filled Jack's mind. "You belong here just like the others. You are one of us now." Jack screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the ever-expanding void. His body trembled violently as his memories, his very essence, began to dissolve into the darkness around him. He was no longer Jack. He was part of the place now, just another forgotten soul lost to the endless expanse of the void. And in the distance, somewhere beyond the reach of his shattered mind, the figure's hollow eyes gleamed in the dark, waiting for the next lost soul to wander in, to join them, to join the forgotten. "I apologize for the mistake earlier. I will continue in English as you requested." The darkness did not dissipate. Jack did not escape. The feeling of emptiness and despair wrapped around him with a tightening grip, and something terrible, settled deep in his mind. It was as if something was growing inside of him, something dark and foreign to his being. Like something was taking form, feeding on his consciousness, integrating itself into his soul. The figure before him, that distorted creature, was only beginning its work, and Jack felt like he couldn't fight it, as though he hadn't been the one to decide to fight in the first place. The sound of the creature's whisper grew louder. Every word it spoke felt like a wave crashing into his thoughts, eroding them, hollowing him out. We all do it. Everyone falls here," it echoed in his mind, each syllable a weight on his chest. With each whisper, Jack felt himself slipping further away from himself. He was no longer a person struggling to escape. He was just an entity, a presence without a body, empty and drifting in the endless space around him. The walls of the place, if there had ever been any, vanished, leaving only an unfathomable abyss of darkness and whispers. "Why?" Jack whimpered, his voice barely a whisper, lost in the sea of voices surrounding him. "Why are you doing this to me?" The creature didn't answer right away. Instead, its hollow eyes seemed to reflect Jack's anguish, his suffering pulsating in the depths of the void. And then, with a shudder, the creature spoke, its voice rougher, more distorted, as if the words themselves were twisting in its throat. "Because you found us. Everyone who's been here. They've done so without meaning to, but then they stay. There's no going back." The air around Jack grew thicker, as if every word from the creature made the space feel more oppressive, more crushing. He could feel it inside his chest now, the heavy presence of whatever force was taking over him. The creature's words were beginning to make sense, even if they didn't. Jack had never intended to come here. He hadn't planned on wandering into this nightmare. Yet now, it seemed that fate had already chosen for him. "Stay with us," the creature continued, its voice now a whispering rasp that seemed to crawl under his skin. "You're just like the others. You'll stay too. We always do." Jack tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His body had long stopped obeying his commands. He could feel his thoughts slipping away, the fight draining from him as the creature's presence filled the air around him. It was as if the creature was not just within the room, but inside him, mingling with his own thoughts, with his very essence. "You're not alone," the creature whispered, "and you never will be." Jack tried to fight it. He tried to hold on to his sanity, but the darkness and the whispers were consuming him from within. Every part of him screamed for escape, but the more he fought, the more it felt like the creature had already won. The air grew colder, the silence punctuated by his erratic breathing and the faint, distant whispers of others who had fallen into this trap before him. He could feel their presence, not just in the room, but within him in the spaces between his thoughts. "Please," he begged, but the words fell into the abyss, swallowed by the overwhelming silence. The creature was now beside him, its cold breath grazing his ear. "There's no way out. Not for you. Not for anyone who enters here." Jack's mind began to unravel piece by piece. His body trembled uncontrollably as the realization sank in. He was never going to leave. Welcome to Horror Stories for Sleep Volume 7. Volume 7 already, and I'm getting all kinds of support. Thank you people for subscribing. Let's begin. The rain began to fall in relentless sheets, drumming against the windshield of the old, battered station wagon. The headlights barely pierced through the oppressive darkness that swallowed the winding back road, casting weak, jittering beams onto the slick asphalt. Maddie gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles bone white, as she glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing, just the yawning black of the road behind her. Her heart thudded in her chest, though she couldn't explain why. The air inside the car felt suffocating, heavy with something unspoken. She turned up the heater, trying to banish the chill that had crept into her bones, though she wasn't entirely sure it was the cold causing it. She was lost. The map app on her phone had frozen nearly an hour ago, leaving her to rely on faded road signs and gut instinct. Her destination, a remote cabin promised by a coworker as the perfect escape, felt like a cruel joke now. The directions had seemed straightforward until the rainstorm hit, turning familiar landmarks into obscured blurs and the road into a treacherous maze. As she rounded another sharp curve, the headlights illuminated a sign, a gas station barely visible through the deluge. Relief washed over her. The station was decrepit, its paint peeling and its lone pump looking as though it hadn't dispensed fuel in decades. Still, the flickering neon open sign in the window was enough to make her pull over. The moment she stepped out of the car, the rain hit her like ice needles. She ran to the station's entrance, pushing open the glass door. A bell jangled overhead, announcing her arrival. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and oil. Rows of dusty shelves lined the small space, filled with canned goods and faded snacks that looked as old as the building. Behind the counter sat a man, his face obscured by the brim of a tattered hat. He didn't look up as she entered, his gnarled fingers busy with something beneath the counter. "Hi," Maddie said, her voice shaking slightly. My phone's dead, and I think I'm lost. Do you have a charger? Or maybe some directions?" The man's hand paused, mid-motion. Slowly, he raised his head, his face emerging from the shadow of the hat. His eyes were pale and glassy, the irises nearly blending with the whites. When he spoke, his voice was gravelly, like stones scraping against metal. "You shouldn't be out here." Maddie frowned. "I know, the storm's awful, but..." "No," he interrupted, his voice sharper now. "I mean, you shouldn't be here." A chill ran down her spine, colder than the rain. "What do you mean?" The man leaned back, exposing the rest of his face. Deep scars carved into his cheeks created a grotesque, jagged smile. He gestured lazily to the window. "You'll want to get moving before it catches you." Maddie's breath hitched. "Before what catches me?" The man didn't answer. He simply stood, revealing a hunched figure clad in greasy overalls. Without another word, he shuffled to the back room, the door creaking shut behind him. Maddie stood frozen for a moment, the uneasy silence pressing against her. Suddenly, the bell above the entrance jangled again. She whipped around, expecting to see another traveler seeking refuge from the storm. Instead, the door hung slightly ajar, swinging on its rusted hinges. Beyond it, the rain poured harder, the world outside a smear of gray and black. "Hello," she called out, her voice small in the cavernous quiet. No response. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the shelves. Maddie swallowed hard, stepping closer to the counter. She noticed, for the first time, a small notebook lying open on its surface. The pages were warped with water stains, the ink smeared, but a few words stood out clearly. "Do not look outside." Her pulse quickened as the wind howled, rattling the windows. Maddie took a shaky step backward, her gaze darting to the window despite herself. For a moment, all she saw was the rain. But then, something moved. It wasn't a person, nor an animal. It was too fast, too fluid. A shadow rippled across the glass, disappearing into the storm before she could fully register its form. Her breath came in short gasps now. She clutched the edge of the counter, her fingers digging into the worn wood. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself. "It's just the storm." But then the back room door creaked open. The man emerged, but something was wrong. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as though his joints were bending in ways they shouldn't. His head tilted to one side, a guttural sound escaping his lips, a wet, gurgling noise that made Maddie's stomach turn. He stepped closer, and she stumbled back, her heel catching on a loose tile. She hit the ground hard, the air rushing from her lungs. As she scrambled to her feet, her eyes darted to the window again. This time, the shadow didn't disappear. It loomed, its outline sharper now, a grotesque, towering shape that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the rain. And then, slowly, it turned toward her. Maddie's heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, her hands slick with sweat and the remnants of rain. Her gaze was locked on the window, where the shape outside had grown clearer, more defined. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched in unnatural angles, as though they had been twisted and bent in ways that defied the laws of anatomy. The silhouette flickered, its movements jerky, as though it was still adjusting to the space it now occupied. Behind her, the man let out another gurgling moan, stepping closer, each step dragging like a heavy weight. His pale eyes were fixed on her with a predatory intensity, a faint but unmistakable hunger lurking in their depths. He reached for her, his fingers stiff and twitching, before suddenly halting. His head jerked to the side, his body freezing in place. Outside, the shadow moved again, but this time, it didn't vanish into the storm. It stepped closer to the window, its presence growing more oppressive, as though it were pressing against the very glass, demanding to be seen. Maddie's breath hitched. The shape seemed to grow larger with every passing second, its distorted form bending and twisting as if it were no longer constrained by the natural order of things. A sudden thought gripped her, a realization that tightened her throat and twisted her stomach in knots. It wasn't the man behind her that was dangerous. It was what had been lurking outside. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She tore her eyes away from the window and darted toward the door, her hands fumbling for the handle. It was stuck, locked, just as she had seen earlier. Panic rose within her chest, her breaths coming in ragged gasps as she tugged at the door in vain. Behind her, the man began to chuckle, a low, raspy sound that grated against her nerves, reverberating through the stale air of the station. His laugh seemed to be growing, multiplying, echoing around her like a chorus of tortured souls. The walls of the small station trembled, as though the laughter was shaking them from the inside out. Maddie's eyes darted to the back room. The man's body was now swaying unnaturally, the jerky movements becoming more pronounced. His fingers twitched uncontrollably, stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes, as if they were too long for his hands. His mouth opened wide, too wide, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. The grotesque smile he wore earlier had stretched to an impossible width, as though it was being forced open by some unseen force. And then a noise, a loud crash from the window. The shadow outside had slammed against the glass, its massive form pressing up against the station like a wave about to break. The impact made the entire building shudder. Maddie turned just in time to see the man lurch toward her, his movements suddenly swift, predatory. But the moment he reached for her, he stopped, his eyes locked onto something behind her, his expression shifting to one of intense, almost frantic fear. Before she could turn to see what he was looking at, the door to the back room burst open with an ear-splitting screech. From the doorway, an unnatural figure emerged, far worse than anything Maddie could have imagined. Its body was contorted, its limbs elongated in ways that made the man's movements look almost graceful in comparison. Its face was a hollow void, a black pit of nothingness, but a terrible presence radiated from it, a weight that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Maddie could feel her pulse racing, her body trembling uncontrollably as the air grew thick with the sound of something skittering just beyond the edges of her perception. She had no choice but to back away, her hands searching wildly for anything she could use to defend herself. But the room was barren, save for the shelves of decaying goods. The thing in front of her moved again, its grotesque body scraping against the walls, its limbs twitching and jerking like something out of a nightmare. It seemed to be drawn to the man, or perhaps the other way around. The two locked eyes, and in that instant, the air shifted. The man's fear had turned to something else, something darker. The thing's hollow form seemed to swell, as though the very air around it was being consumed by its presence. It advanced toward the man with a slow, deliberate pace. He recoiled, but there was no escape. It was clear now he wasn't just afraid of what was outside. He had been waiting for it. The man's lips curled into a smile again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a mocking grin. It was one of understanding, of shared knowledge that Maddie couldn't begin to comprehend. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. The thing reached out, grabbing him with unnatural speed, its hands folding around his head like a vice. The man let out a strangled scream, but it was cut off as the creature pulled him into the darkness. Maddie's heart leapt into her throat as she spun toward the door, realizing that the only way out was through whatever that thing was. She ran, every muscle in her body screaming for her to get away, to escape from the nightmare that had been closing in on her since she arrived. But as she reached for the door once more, the air grew colder, thicker, and then she heard it, a whisper, "Stay." The door slammed shut before she could touch it, and she was plunged into darkness. The darkness felt alive, suffocating, as if it had weight. Maddie's breath quickened, panic clawing at her chest. Her eyes strained, desperately searching for something, anything, that could offer her a clue, a way out. But there was nothing. No light, no sign of the twisted figure that had just consumed the man. Only the sound of her own heartbeat, pounding so loudly in her ears that it drowned out everything else. A shiver crawled up her spine. The air around her grew colder still, as if the walls themselves were exhaling some unseen chill. Her hands, trembling uncontrollably, reached out in front of her, fingers brushing against the rough surface of the door. The texture felt wrong, slick, sticky, like something had been smeared across it. Then the whisper came again. "Stay." Her body froze. The voice wasn't coming from any direction. It was everywhere. Inside her skull, in the very marrow of her bones. It was inescapable, impossible to ignore. Felt familiar, in a way she couldn't comprehend. She hadn't heard it before, but it felt like something she had known forever. Something that had always been a part of her. Maddie gritted her teeth and slammed her palm against the door, as if by sheer force she could break through the paralysis it had caused. She had to get out, had to find a way to escape before whatever had taken the man could claim her too. But the door didn't budge. A low, guttural noise filled the space, like the creaking of old bones or the groan of something enormous shifting in the dark. Her pulse spiked, her throat tight as the oppressive darkness pressed in from every corner of the room. She spun around, every muscle in her body tense, waiting for the presence to make itself known. The shadows shifted. The air thickened, grew heavy, as though something was moving beneath the surface, creeping through the unseen cracks. Then she felt it, something touching her. Not physically, but in a way that defied all logic. It was like the air around her had solidified into something tangible. "I've been waiting," the voice murmured again, far too close. It was in her head, yet not. There was no sense of it coming from a particular direction. It was everywhere, inescapable. She could feel it, the weight of its gaze pressing down on her as if it were right beside her, just out of sight. The sound of movement came from behind her, a slow, deliberate drag of something long and thin scraping against the floor. The hairs on the back of her neck stood at attention, her blood turning to ice as she slowly turned to face whatever was creeping in the darkness. There was nothing at first, only the heavy silence that clung to the air, thick and oppressive. But then she saw it, a sliver of motion in the shadows, something that moved just at the edge of her vision. Her stomach lurched as her mind tried to comprehend it. It was small at first, a shadow within the shadows, shifting with a fluidity that made it seem like a part of the darkness itself. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw it more clearly. It wasn't just a shape. It was a person. No, not a person. The outline of a person, perhaps, but twisted and malformed in a way that made her stomach churn. Its limbs were too long, too thin, like they had been stretched beyond reason. Its body moved in disjointed jerks, as though it was struggling to hold itself together. Each movement was unnaturally fast, too quick to follow, too erratic. Its head swiveled at an impossible angle. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly in the dark, two pale smears in the black void where its face should have been. The creature made no sound, its movements as silent as the darkness around it. But Maddie could feel it, feel its presence inching closer, even though she couldn't see it clearly. It was everywhere and nowhere all at once. She took a hesitant step back, her breathing shallow and quick, but her feet felt like they were sinking into the floor. The air thickened again, wrapping around her like a physical force, pressing her against the door, preventing her from moving. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the faint, wet sound of something dripping, something large, something alive. The creature's head snapped to one side, its neck twisting at an impossible angle. For a brief moment, the glowing remnants of its eyes met hers. Then it smiled. The grin was stretched across its face, impossibly wide, its jagged teeth too numerous, too sharp to belong to any human being. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of something hungry, something that had been starved for far too long. And it wasn't smiling at her. It was smiling at the door behind her. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew what was on the other side. She knew what it wanted. The thing wasn't after her. Not yet. It was waiting for the door to open. Maddie's mind raced. The thing, whatever it was, wanted her to open the door. But why? What was behind it that could possibly interest something so wrong? She had no time to answer her own questions as the air grew denser, pulsating with an unseen energy that made her teeth ache. It felt like the room itself was alive, contracting and expanding in rhythm with her panicked breaths. The creature tilted its head further, the grotesque smile growing wider. Then it raised a hand, or what she assumed was a hand. The limb was skeletal, stretched unnaturally long, the fingers tapering into jagged points, pointed directly at her, then at the door. Its intentions were clear. Open it. No, Maddie muttered, her voice barely a whisper against the oppressive silence. She pressed her back against the door, her palms flat against the sticky surface as if she could physically hold it shut. I won't. The creature's smile faltered. Its head jerked forward, twitching violently as its entire body contorted into an unnatural pose, almost as if it was testing its limits. The room filled with the sound of something cracking, bones, or perhaps the very walls themselves. The creature leaned closer, its glowing eyes now mere inches from her face, though there was still an insurmountable gulf of shadow between them. You don't understand, the voice whispered. Not from the creature's non-existent mouth, but from everywhere at once. It was colder now, more insistent, laced with something that felt disturbingly like desperation. It's not for me. Maddie shook her head, her body trembling. I don't care. I'm not opening it. Her defiance seemed to amuse the creature. The grin returned, impossibly wider now, stretching across what should have been its face. It moved back into the shadows with a sickening lurch, disappearing for a moment. Maddie felt a brief, fleeting hope that it was gone. But the sound of movement behind her crushed that hope instantly. Something was on the other side of the door. The pounding started softly, a dull, rhythmic thud that grew louder with each strike. Maddie jumped away from the door, her hands trembling at her sides as the sticky residue clinging to her palms made her skin crawl. She could see the door shake with each impact, the wood splintering at the edges. Whatever was on the other side wasn't going to wait much longer. The creature reappeared, now standing fully upright, or at least as upright as its grotesque body allowed. Its limbs seemed to grow longer with every passing second, its outline becoming more indistinct, blending with the dark. It gestured to the door again, this time with both hands, as if urging her to comply. If you don't, it will. What will? Maddie shouted, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. What's on the other side? The creature didn't answer. Instead, it began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that echoed endlessly in the enclosed space. The pounding on the door intensified, shaking the entire room. Maddie stumbled backward, her mind screaming for her to do something, anything. She looked at the door, then at the creature, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. She could feel the thing's gaze, even without eyes. It wasn't just watching her. It was waiting for her to make a choice. And then she heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from the other side of the door. Maddie? It was a man's voice. Familiar, warm, desperate. Her heart clenched. Dad, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The pounding stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Maddie, the voice repeated, softer now. Please, I need your help. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her head spinning. It sounded exactly like him, but it couldn't be. He was gone. He'd been gone for years. Don't, the creature hissed, its voice sharp and venomous. The first time it had shown anything close to emotion. It's not him. Maddie's breathing hitched, her hands clenching into fists. But it sounds like, "It's not him," the creature snarled, the grin vanishing entirely. His form grew more distorted, more frantic. For the first time, Maddie saw something other than malice in its expression. Fear. The pounding resumed, harder and faster now, the wood splintering further with each blow. Maddie's mind raced. If she opened the door, she might find her father, or she might unleash whatever horror lay behind it. If she did nothing, the thing on the other side might break through anyway. Her hands hovered over the handle. Her entire body shook with indecision. "Maddie," the voice on the other side called again, softer now, tinged with sadness. "Don't you want to see me?" Tears streamed down her face as she looked back at the creature. It was still there, silent now, watching her with its glowing, empty eyes. The choice was hers. Maddie's trembling hand hovered over the doorknob, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The voice on the other side sounded so real, so heartbreakingly familiar. It has to be him. It has to. But deep down, in the marrow of her bones, she felt the wrongness of it. Every instinct screamed at her to stop. Behind her, the creature remained still, its jagged outline flickering faintly in the dim light. It had stopped trying to persuade her. It didn't need to anymore. The choice was hers, and whatever was coming would be her doing. The pounding on the door softened, replaced by a steady scraping sound. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like nails dragging against wood. Maddie cringed at the sound, her teeth grinding together. "Maddie, please," the voice came again, barely audible over the scraping. "You don't understand. I can't hold on much longer." Her heart twisted painfully. The way the voice cracked, the pleading undertone. It was everything her father would have sounded like in desperation. She wanted to believe. She needed to believe. "Maddie," it whispered again. "It's so dark in here." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she let out a broken sob. I don't know what to do," she cried, spinning to face the creature. "What's behind this door? Why is this happening?" The creature tilted its head, its jagged grin absent now. Its voice was softer this time, though still unnervingly cold. "Not all things buried stay buried. You've dug too deep." "What are you talking about?" Maddie shouted, frustration mixing with her terror. The creature didn't answer. Instead, it extended one long, clawed hand and pointed toward the door again, as if to remind her of the urgency. The scraping stopped. Her breath caught in her throat as the silence pressed down on her like a physical weight. Then, a faint rattling came from the other side of the door, like chains being dragged across stone. Maddie took a step back, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Maddie," the voice called again, but this time it wasn't just her father's voice. Others joined it, a cacophony of whispers overlapping, each voice more desperate and fragmented than the last. "Help us. Let us out. Please." Her knees buckled, and she pressed her hands over her ears, trying to drown out the sounds. The door began to shake violently, the wood splintering as cracks spiderwebbed across its surface. The creature hissed, recoiling from the door. Its form seemed to shrink slightly, as if whatever was on the other side posed a threat even to it. "Don't open it," it snarled. "You don't want to see what waits for you." Maddie looked between the creature and the door, her mind spiraling into chaos. Every rational thought warred with her desperate longing. What if it really is him? The rattling grew louder, more frantic. The voices grew sharper, their desperation unbearable. "Maddie, please," they cried in unison, shaking the door with renewed force. Her hand shot out, gripping the knob before she could stop herself. The creature screamed, a guttural, inhuman sound that made the walls tremble. "No!" it bellowed, lunging toward her. But it was too late. The moment Maddie turned the knob, a searing heat erupted from the door, forcing her to stumble back. The wood cracked and split as an otherworldly light burst through the gaps, illuminating the room with a blinding, unnatural glow. The voices stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the door swung open, revealing a yawning, endless void that pulsed with a sickly, churning light. Shapes moved within it, twisting, writhing things that defied comprehension. Maddie's breath caught as a wave of unimaginable terror crashed over her, freezing her in place. From the void, something began to emerge. The void churned violently as a form began to coalesce from its depths. It wasn't human, far from it. Its shape defied logic, constantly shifting between grotesque configurations. Sprawling appendages, impossibly large eyes, and a pulsating mass that seemed alive in its own twisted rhythm. Maddie staggered back, her breath hitching as a wave of nausea and terror threatened to consume her. The creature's presence was overwhelming, its sheer size and power pressing against her mind, as though it could crush her with thought alone. The voices that had begged her for salvation were gone, replaced by a low, guttural hum that resonated deep within her chest. The door frame splintered and cracked as the entity fully emerged, its bulk folding and unfolding into impossible shapes. Maddie tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The creature didn't lunge or attack. Instead, it watched, not with eyes, but with an all-encompassing awareness that stripped away any illusion of safety she had clung to. The jagged creature that had been taunting her recoiled, its form shrinking to a shadowed wisp. "You've doomed us all," it whispered, its voice trembling for the first time. Maddie's knees buckled as the entity shifted closer, the void behind it expanding and consuming the walls of the room. Reality itself seemed to warp and twist in its presence. She felt her body unraveling, not physically, but in some deeper, more terrifying way. "Why?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely audible. "Why me?" The creature didn't answer, but she felt its response, an overwhelming sense of inevitability. It wasn't malice or rage that drove it. It was hunger. Maddie's choice had only opened the door to what was always waiting. The void surged forward, swallowing the floor beneath her feet. She fell, spiraling into the endless, twisting nothingness. Time stretched and fractured. Moments felt like years, and years felt like moments. Maddie's memories splintered apart, each fragment devoured by the churning void. And yet, she was aware, painfully aware, as her identity unraveled. She became one of the countless voices she had heard before, trapped in the void, endlessly calling out for help to anyone who might dare to listen. The door slammed shut with a deafening finality. In the small, empty room, silence returned. The jagged creature reappeared, alone once more. It slithered toward the closed door, its form flickering as it muttered to itself. "Another fool," it hissed, voice dripping with disdain. "Always another," but as it retreated into the shadows, the faintest crack reappeared in the door's surface. And somewhere, far away, another soul began to hear the whispers. The letter arrived on a damp Tuesday morning, its edges worn and the paper stiff from age. Jack hadn't expected anything unusual to break the monotony of his life, but when he saw the envelope, something inside him stirred. It wasn't the fact that it was addressed to him. It was the handwriting, neat but unfamiliar, that caught his attention. The return address was blank. He hadn't received anything like it in years. He sat down at the kitchen table, unfolding the letter slowly. The paper smelled of mildew, a faint reminder of the dampness that clung to the world outside. His eyes scanned the words, each one drawing him deeper into something he couldn't yet grasp. "You are invited to a place beyond your understanding." Come to the house at the edge of the world. It has waited for you. Jack read the lines twice. His first instinct was to dismiss it. Prank, perhaps. He had no enemies to speak of, but he had heard strange rumors in town over the years. Stories about people receiving letters like this, letters that called them to places they couldn't explain. But none of those rumors were ever real. They were just stories people told when they were bored or afraid. But this letter felt different. The words seemed to pulse with an energy that made his stomach twist. He had heard of the house, vague mentions, fleeting references in local folklore, whispers about a place that existed on the very edge of reality, where time and space blurred into something else entirely. But none of it made sense. It was absurd. Still, as he sat there, the letter in his hands, he felt a tug at his chest. Something compelled him to go. He had no idea what he was about to walk into, but it didn't matter. He couldn't resist. The idea of going to that house to see it for himself was now all he could think about. Jack had lived in a small town for most of his life. Quiet, isolated, with few things to break the monotony. He worked as a mechanic at the local garage, fixing cars that passed through, mostly from tourists who found their way to the nearby mountain range. It was the kind of town that people didn't visit unless they were lost, and most days he was content with that. The routine was comfortable, safe. But now, as he sat in his small apartment, he realized he wasn't happy. He hadn't been happy for years. He hadn't realized how empty his life had become until the letter arrived. Now it was as if something inside him had awakened. A long-buried curiosity, a need to escape the prison he'd built around himself. So he made his decision. The following day, he went to the train station without much thought, bought a one-way ticket with no real destination in mind. The letter hadn't given him much to go on, just the cryptic invitation. The house at the edge of the world. It wasn't a place marked on any map, nor did he have a name or a person to guide him there. It was as if the letter had pulled him into something much larger than himself, something he couldn't escape. The train ride was long, and the further he traveled, the more unsettled he became. The land outside the window grew unfamiliar, the terrain dark and desolate. The usual hum of the city faded into a strange, eerie silence. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn deeper into some kind of trap, but the letter, the house, kept him going. After hours of travel, the train finally stopped at a small station in the middle of nowhere. The platform was deserted, and the air smelled of wet earth and decay. Jack stepped off the train, his boots crunching against the gravel. The world around him was still. The trees nearby looked twisted, their limbs reaching out like dark fingers, clawing at the sky. A sign above the platform read Edgewood. Jack had never heard of it. There was nothing here. No welcoming faces, no bustling streets, only an empty road stretching into the fog. And there, at the end of the road, looming like a specter, was a mansion. It was old, its stones weathered and cracked, but it stood tall and imposing. The house at the edge of the world. He could feel it in his bones now, the weight of it pressing on him, pulling him toward it. He had no choice but to walk toward it. The air grew colder with every step he took. The trees seemed to close in around him, and the fog thickened, swallowing the world whole. He couldn't see anything except the faint outline of the mansion ahead, its silhouette barely visible through the mist. When he reached the gates, they creaked open of their own accord, as if they had been waiting for him. He didn't hesitate. He stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, a strange stillness settled over the place. No birds sang, no wind blew. There was only the eerie silence and the scent of decay in the air. The house was grand, its walls adorned with portraits of long-forgotten faces, their eyes seeming to follow him as he walked deeper into the entry hall. The floors creaked beneath his feet, and the house groaned with age, as though it were alive. He felt it then, the weight of history pressing down on him. The house had waited for him, just as the letter said. But why? And for what? A voice echoed through the halls. It was soft, a whisper at first, but it grew louder with each passing moment. It wasn't coming from any one place. but from all around him. It beckoned him, promising something, but Jack couldn't understand what it was saying. As he moved deeper into the house, the walls seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, colder. The floor beneath his feet seemed to buckle, and the portraits on the walls twisted into grotesque, distorted shapes, their eyes bulging, mouths open in silent screams. He had reached the heart of the house. The voice now spoke clearly, its words chilling him to the core. "You've come for something, Jack, but you will never leave. Not the same. You'll never leave at all." A door opened at the end of the hallway, and Jack, trembling, stepped toward it. He knew, without a doubt, that whatever was behind that door would change everything. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door, his mind torn between the pull of the unknown and the instinct to turn back, to flee, to forget everything that had led him here. But he couldn't stop now. Something deep within him, something primal, urged him forward. The air felt thicker, as if the house itself was drawing breath, waiting, watching. He pushed the door open, its hinges screeching in protest. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single chandelier, its crystals flickering with a pale, unnatural glow. The furniture was ancient, draped in layers of dust and cobwebs, yet everything seemed perfectly intact, as if untouched by time. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with strange artifacts. Jars of pickled creatures, faded books with symbols Jack didn't recognize, and mirrors that seemed to reflect things that weren't there. At the center of the room stood a large, ornate chair, its velvet cushions dark with age. In front of it, a figure sat, its features obscured by shadow. The voice that had been echoing throughout the house now emanated from this figure, cold and distant. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice low, smooth, almost comforting, like the whisper of an old friend. "You've come for answers, haven't you, Jack? You've come for the one thing that has eluded you your whole life." Jack's throat tightened. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The words were lodged in his chest, stuck like thorns. The figure shifted in the chair, and Jack felt his eyes drawn to it against his will. As the shadows receded, the figure revealed itself. A woman, or what had once been a woman. Her skin was pale, stretched too tight over her bones, and her eyes gleamed with an otherworldly hunger. She smiled, but it was a smile that didn't belong to a human, a smile that only deepened the sense of wrongness in the room. "You think you are seeking redemption," the woman continued, her voice now tinged with something darker. "But the truth, Jack, is far more complicated than that. Redemption is a lie. It's nothing but a comforting illusion, a reason to keep breathing when you know deep down that you are already damned." Jack's pulse raced as her words sank into him. He hadn't realized how badly he had wanted to believe in redemption until now. He hadn't realized how much he had needed it. But now, here in this twisted place, the idea of redemption seemed like nothing more than a cruel joke. "Who are you?" Jack finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. He wasn't sure if he wanted an answer, or if he was just trying to delay the inevitable. The woman's lips curled upward, her smile widening until it seemed too wide for her face, too unnatural. "I am the one who sees," she said softly. "The one who knows everything you've done, everything you've hidden. The one who can give you what you want most, if you're willing to pay the price." The room seemed to pulse with energy as her words resonated in the air. Jack's mind raced. What did she mean by pay the price? What kind of bargain was she offering? "You want to know why you're here, don't you?" the woman asked, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling understanding. "You've spent years running from your past, hiding from the things you've done. You thought you could outrun it, but you can't, Jack. You can't outrun the darkness inside you." Jack's breath caught in his throat. The memories, those dark, twisted memories of his past, flashed in front of his eyes. He could see them clearly now, the faces of the people he had hurt, the ones he had betrayed, the ones whose lives he had ruined. The guilt, the shame, the endless weight of it all. It had always been with him, lurking just below the surface, gnawing at him. "Let me show you," the woman said, her voice soft but insistent. "Let me show you what you've been running from." The room seemed to darken as her words took root, and Jack felt his body go rigid. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. His mind was gripped by a force he couldn't understand, a force that dragged him into the shadows of his past. The first memory hit him like a wave, sharp, brutal. He was standing in a dark alleyway, watching as a man, bloodied and bruised, begged for his life. Jack had been the one to do it, the one to put the man in that position. He remembered the rush, the power, the feeling of control. But now, looking back, it felt like a nightmare. His hands were stained with blood, and the faces of the people he had hurt seemed to close in on him, suffocating him. The next memory was worse. He was in a small, dimly lit room, the walls closing in around him. He could hear the pleading voices, feel the fear in the air, the way it clung to everything. He had been the cause of it all, the lies, the betrayal. He had promised to help, to protect, but in the end, he had only made it worse. The woman's laughter echoed in his ears, cruel and knowing. She reveled in his torment, in his suffering. She knew every mistake, every failure. She had seen it all. "Do you understand now, Jack?" she whispered. "Do you understand why you're here? Why you've always been drawn to this place?" Jack couldn't speak. He couldn't even think. The weight of his past, of all the choices he had made, crushed him. The memories were too much to bear. He wanted to scream, to escape, but there was no way out. The house had him, and it would never let him go. "You can make it stop, Jack," the woman said. "You can end it all. All you have to do is make a choice." Her words echoed in the chamber, like a promise and a curse. Jack didn't know what she meant, but he felt the urgency in her voice. He didn't know what kind of power she held, but he knew that whatever it was, it could give him what he wanted most: relief, redemption, freedom from the burden of his past. But at what cost? The woman leaned forward, her smile widening. "Do you want to escape, Jack? Do you want to forget all the pain, all the mistakes? Or are you willing to face it? Are you willing to accept who you really are?" Jack's head spun. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, the weight of his past pressing down on his chest. He was suffocating. "You have a choice, Jack," the woman said again, her voice sweet as honey. "But remember, every choice comes with a price. And once you make it, there is no turning back." Jack was on the verge of collapse. He felt his legs giving way beneath him, the weight of his decisions too much to bear. He could hear the voices in his head, the voices of the people he had wronged, the voices of his own conscience. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in on him. And then he made his choice. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. His hands trembled as they gripped the edges of the chair. The woman's eyes never left him, their cold gaze like a magnet, pulling him deeper into the web she had woven. "You've made your choice, haven't you?" she asked, her voice like velvet, smooth and manipulative. There was no sympathy, no understanding, just the sharp edge of inevitability. "You want to escape. You want the pain to end." He nodded, barely able to speak. The weight of the memories, the ghosts of all that he had done, pressed down on him with unbearable force. His past had been a twisted trail of lies and cruelty, and every step forward had been built on the suffering of others. But now there was a chance to be free, a chance to sever the ties that bound him to his failures. "Very well," the woman said, standing up slowly, the darkness in the room swirling around her like an inky mist. She extended a hand, pale and long-fingered, towards him. "Take my hand, Jack, and all that you wish for will be yours." There was a moment of hesitation. The air seemed to thicken, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to act. Jack could feel the pull of the woman's power, the allure of her offer. It was everything he had ever wanted, the release from the torment, the end of his endless self-loathing. But a flicker of doubt stirred deep within him, just below the surface. Was this truly a chance at redemption? Or was it another trap, another false promise luring him deeper into darkness? He glanced at the door, the faintest thought of escape crossing his mind. But the door was now sealed tight, the hallway outside nothing but shadows. There was no way back. I want it," Jack whispered, his voice thick with desperation. His hand shook as he reached out, brushing against hers. The instant his skin made contact with hers, the room seemed to collapse in on itself. A cold, numbing wave washed over him, as if the very essence of life had been drained from the air. His vision blurred, and he felt his body grow heavier, as if his soul itself was being sucked out of him, leaving only a hollow shell. The woman's grin widened, impossibly wide, stretching across her face, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Her eyes, once gleaming with power, now looked like empty voids, devoid of all humanity. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" she purred. "Did you think you could escape your past with a simple wish?" The room spun wildly as Jack's heart began to race, his breath shallow and frantic. He tried to pull away, but it was too late. The woman's grip tightened around him, her fingers cold like iron. The shadows in the room seemed to twist, forming grotesque shapes, reaching out for him. "I offered you escape, Jack," she whispered, her voice no longer sweet but venomous. "But you are not the one to make the choice. You never were." He struggled, his body fighting against an invisible force that held him in place. His mind screamed for release, for an end to the agony. The shadows around him grew thicker, darker, until they consumed everything. The last vestiges of light flickered and died. When Jack awoke, he was lying on the floor of the room, the chair gone, the woman nowhere to be seen. The room was quiet, almost too quiet. His head throbbed as he tried to sit up, his muscles aching as if he had been contorted in unnatural positions for hours. The silence was oppressive. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and decay. Jack's heart pounded as he slowly pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. Something had changed. Something was wrong. He turned, his eyes scanning the room. Everything was the same, and yet nothing was. The walls, the shelves, the mirrors, all seemed to pulsate with a strange, unsettling energy. The room itself felt alive, as if it were aware of his presence, watching him with malevolent intent. A low, guttural sound echoed from the corner of the room. Jack's eyes shot towards it, his breath catching in his throat. There, emerging from the darkness, were figures, shadows, but not shadows. They were vaguely human, their features twisted, distorted. Their eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and their mouths opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Jack stumbled backward, panic flooding his veins. He had seen them before, in his dreams, in his nightmares. These were the faces of the people he had wronged, the ones he had hurt. They were here, and they were angry. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, this can't be happening." But the figures advanced, their limbs moving in jerky, unnatural motions, their eyes never leaving him. He could feel their presence closing in on him, suffocating him. "Jack," one of them hissed, its voice raspy and distorted, like a broken record. "You wanted escape, didn't you? You wanted redemption." Jack's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This was his price. This was what he had paid for his wish. He hadn't escaped his past. He had only deepened his torment. The figures surrounded him, their grotesque faces contorted in expressions of rage and pain. They reached out for him, their hands cold and clammy, their touch like ice. "You can never escape what you've done, Jack," another figure croaked. "You can never outrun the darkness inside you." Jack tried to run, but his legs felt like lead. He stumbled, his feet tripping over each other as he tried to make it to the door. But the door was gone. The room was a prison, and he was trapped inside it, with the ghosts of his past closing in. The figures closed in on him, their whispers growing louder, filling his mind with their accusations. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All that remained was the suffocating darkness, the relentless weight of his guilt, and the gnawing feeling that he had made the wrong choice. And then, just as he felt the cold hands close around his throat, the darkness swallowed him whole. The blackness that consumed Jack was suffocating, like drowning in a void that knew no end. There was no sound, no light, no escape, just endless, crushing pressure. For a moment, he thought he had died. But death, he quickly realized, was not what awaited him. His body felt weightless, as though he were drifting in some sort of dark limbo. Time had no meaning here. His thoughts swirled, fragmented and broken, torn apart by the haunting voices of those he had wronged, their accusations replaying in his mind like a cruel, endless loop. Each face, each name, flashed before him with unrelenting speed, their hatred and pain directed squarely at him. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness lifted. Jack gasped, his lungs aching as he inhaled the musty air. His eyes snapped open, only to be met with an oppressive, gray sky overhead. He was no longer in the room. He was standing in the middle of a barren, windswept field, the ground beneath his feet cracked and dry. The land stretched out in every direction, devoid of life, its emptiness mirroring the hollow ache in his chest. The figures, the shadows were gone, but the weight of their presence lingered, a constant, gnawing reminder of what he had done. Jack's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his nails digging into the skin of his palms. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was no relief, only the crushing reality that this, whatever this was his new existence. As he looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings, he saw something in the distance, an old, decaying building. It stood alone, broken and abandoned, a haunting silhouette against the oppressive sky. It was familiar, somehow, though Jack couldn't place why. Without thinking, he began to walk toward it. His legs moved mechanically, each step heavier than the last, as though the land itself resisted his movement. His thoughts were clouded, his mind still reeling from the events that had brought him here. What had happened? Had he truly made a deal with the devil, or was this just another layer of his punishment? As he approached the building, its details became clearer. It was an old house, long abandoned, its windows shattered, its door hanging off its hinges. The walls were covered in thick layers of grime and soot, the roof caving in at odd angles. It was a place of death, of decay. And yet, there was something familiar about it, something that felt like home. Jack hesitated at the threshold, his hand hovering over the door, his gut twisted with a deep, instinctual dread. He knew what he would find inside, or at least he thought he did. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open, its rusty hinges creaking in protest. The inside of the house was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. The walls seemed to close in on him, as though the house was alive, watching him, judging him. But it was the shadows that filled the room, shifting and writhing in unnatural ways, that truly made his blood run cold. Suddenly, a voice, low and guttural, whispered from the corner of the room. Jack spun around, his heart skipping a beat. "You should never have come back." The words sent a shock of fear through his body, but he could not tear his eyes away from the source of the voice. There, in the far corner of the room, stood a figure. It was cloaked in darkness, its face hidden in the shadows, but Jack could feel its presence, its power. It was the same voice that had spoken to him in the house, the same voice that had manipulated him into making the choice that had led him here. "You thought you could escape," the voice continued, its tone mocking, cruel. "You thought you could outrun the consequences of your actions. But you cannot. You cannot hide from yourself." Jack's heart raced, his mind a mess of conflicting emotions. He wanted to run, to escape, but he knew he couldn't. Not now. Not anymore. He had made his choice, and now he would face the consequences. "You wanted redemption," the voice said, its form beginning to shift, like smoke swirling in the air. "But you've only found more suffering, more torment. This is your fate, Jack, your punishment, and there is no escaping it." Jack opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to plead for mercy, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his voice stolen by the weight of the darkness around him. The figure in the corner stepped forward, its face emerging from the shadows. It was a twisted, horrific version of himself, a reflection of all the guilt, all the darkness that had festered inside him. Its eyes were empty, hollow, just like the ones he had seen in his nightmares. Its lips curled into a sinister smile, and it whispered, "You will never be free." Jack fell to his knees, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. There was no escape, no redemption, no hope. His past, his choices had bound him to this place, and he would never be able to outrun the consequences. The torment would never end. As the figure stepped closer, Jack felt the darkness consume him once again, his vision fading to black. The darkness that swallowed Jack felt heavier this time, as if the weight of the void was pressing him deeper into its grasp. But this time he wasn't floating aimlessly. He could feel the ground beneath him, cold, damp, and unforgiving stone. Slowly, awareness returned to him. His body ached, his head throbbed, and the sharp metallic scent of blood hung in the air. When he opened his eyes, Jack found himself in what looked like an ancient, decrepit hall. The walls were made of cracked stone, slick with moss and grime, and faint, otherworldly light flickered from torches mounted along the walls. The air was suffused with a chilling dampness, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. Ahead of him, a massive set of double doors loomed, carved from blackened wood and adorned with grotesque, swirling patterns that seemed to writhe when he looked too closely. They exuded a malevolent aura, as though whatever lay beyond was alive and waiting. "Jack," a voice hissed, echoing around the hall. He turned sharply, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Only shadows that seemed to stretch and pulse unnaturally. The voice came again, this time from everywhere and nowhere. "You thought you could escape me." The voice sent shivers down his spine, but it was familiar, hauntingly so. It was his own voice, twisted and layered, as if spoken by something imitating him. "Come," it urged. "You're almost there." Against his better judgment, Jack found himself stepping forward. Each step felt like an eternity, his footsteps echoing loudly against the silence of the hall. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, and the closer he got to the doors, the heavier the air became. When he reached them, he hesitated. The carvings seemed to shift under his gaze, forming grotesque faces contorted in agony. One of them whispered, "Turn back." Another hissed, "It's too late." Ignoring them, Jack pushed against the doors, his hands trembling as the heavy wood groaned open. The space beyond was immense, a cavernous chamber that stretched infinitely in every direction, its ceiling lost in darkness. At its center was a massive, pulsating mass of shadow, a void given form. Tendrils of darkness extended from it, twisting and curling like smoke, and its surface shimmered with an otherworldly iridescence. Jack felt a pull, a magnetic force that drew him closer. The mass seemed alive, breathing, pulsating in rhythm with his own heartbeat. As he stepped into the chamber, the doors behind him slammed shut with a deafening boom. "Welcome," the shadow hissed. Its voice was layered, like 1,000 whispers speaking at once. "You've come far, Jack." Jack swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "What are you?" The shadow pulsed, and for a moment, Jack saw his own face reflected in its surface, distorted and twisted. "I am everything you fear, everything you desire. I am the consequences of your choices, Jack. And I am the one who holds the answers you seek." "You're the one who brought me here," Jack said, his voice trembling. "You're the one who showed me all of this." "I showed you the truth," the shadow corrected. "The truth of who you are, of what you are. And now you must decide." "Decide what?" Jack asked, his fists clenched. "What do you want from me?" The shadow's tendrils extended, encircling him but never touching. "Your fate is in your hands, Jack. You came seeking redemption, but redemption has a price." A tendril of darkness snaked toward him, stopping inches from his chest. From its tip emerged a small black dagger, its blade glinting with a sinister light. "Take this," the shadow said. "Use it. Sacrifice the part of yourself that holds you back, the part that clings to guilt, to weakness. Only then can you be free." Jack stared at the dagger, his heart pounding. It seemed to radiate power, calling to him. But the voice of the shadow wasn't the only one he heard. Echoes of the people he had wronged whispered in his ears, their voices filled with pain and anger. You think freedom comes from running away? One voice hissed. You think a clean slate erases what you've done? You don't deserve freedom, another spat. You deserve this. All of this. Jack's hand hovered over the dagger. His mind raced. If he took it, if he used it, would he truly find peace? Or would he simply be trading one torment for another? The shadow seemed to sense his hesitation. You cannot escape your past, Jack, it said, its voice soothing, almost comforting. But you can control your future. Take the dagger. Free yourself. Jack's fingers closed around the hilt of the blade. It was cold, its surface slick and unyielding. As he lifted it, the voices in his head grew louder, a cacophony of pain and anger and regret. The weight of the dagger was immense, as though it carried the burden of every choice he had ever made. The shadow loomed closer, its form shifting and pulsing. Make your choice, Jack. Sacrifice your guilt, or remain a prisoner of it forever. Jack raised the blade, his hand trembling. The chamber seemed to close in around him, the air thick with tension. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: fear, anger, regret, and a desperate longing for peace. And then he made his choice. The dagger in Jack's hand seemed to hum, as if alive, its dark energy pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. He held it aloft, the point hovering just above his chest, where the shadow tendrils now coiled loosely, waiting, watching. The voices of the people he had wronged grew deafening, filling his mind with chaos, doubt, and recrimination. It's all a lie, one of the voices snarled. This shadow offers nothing but more chains. No, another countered, pleading. This is your chance, Jack. Don't waste it. The conflicting whispers clawed at his thoughts, driving him closer to the edge of madness. The shadow loomed closer, its tendrils forming a semicircle around him, hemming him in. Each movement it made seemed calculated, as though it were savoring the moment. Do it, it urged, its voice honeyed with temptation. Release the burden you carry, and you will find the strength to rise above it. Jack's grip tightened around the dagger. His arm trembled. Could he do it? Could he sever the part of himself that held all the pain, all the guilt, all the humanity he had left? Was that sacrifice worth whatever peace the shadow promised? In the chamber's oppressive silence, another voice rose above the clamor. Faint, but clear and resolute. It was his own voice, untainted and raw. This isn't about freedom, it whispered. This is about power. And power always demands more. Jack froze. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. The shadow didn't want to free him, it wanted to feed on him. The sacrifice wasn't about redemption or letting go of guilt. It was about submission, about surrendering the last shred of control he had over his life. He turned to face the shadow, lowering the dagger slowly. Its surface darkened, the shimmer dimming as if sensing his defiance. No, Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper, but firm. The shadow recoiled slightly, the tendrils quivering. What did you say? I said no, Jack repeated, louder this time. I'm not giving you what you want. The chamber seemed to shudder, the walls vibrating with a low, guttural growl. The shadow's form expanded, towering over him, its tendrils writhing angrily. Foolish mortal, it hissed, the honeyed tone replaced by raw malice. Do you think you can defy me? You came here seeking my power. You think you can leave without paying the price? Jack gritted his teeth, his resolve hardening. Maybe I can't leave, but I'm not giving you the satisfaction. With that, he hurled the dagger to the ground. The blade shattered on impact, releasing a burst of dark energy that rippled through the chamber. The shadow screamed, a sound that pierced through Jack's very soul, and the tendrils lashed out wildly, striking the walls and ceiling. Cracks spiderwebbed through the stone, chunks of debris raining down. The oppressive weight in the air lifted slightly, and for a moment Jack thought he might have gained the upper hand. But then the shadow coiled in on itself, its form condensing into a smaller, more concentrated mass. Its voice was quieter now, but sharper, more menacing. You will regret this, Jack, it said. You think you've won, but you've only sealed your fate. I am not bound by this place. Wherever you go, I will follow. Whatever you do, I will haunt you. There is no escape." The ground beneath Jack's feet began to crumble, and he stumbled backward, barely keeping his balance. The shadow surged forward, a wave of darkness that engulfed him. He felt its cold tendrils wrap around his body, squeezing, pulling, dragging him into the void. And then he was falling. When Jack opened his eyes, he was lying on the forest floor, the canopy of twisted, skeletal trees above him blotting out the sky. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the faint sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant animal cries, felt unnaturally muted. He pushed himself to his feet, every muscle in his body aching. The memory of the shadow's voice lingered in his mind, a persistent echo that refused to fade. "You think you can escape me?" it had said. "There is no escape." Jack glanced around, trying to get his bearings. The forest seemed endless, its paths winding and indistinguishable. But as he turned, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Carved into the bark of a nearby tree were the same grotesque symbols that had adorned the shadow's doors. They glowed faintly, pulsing with a sinister light. And they weren't just on one tree, they were everywhere, forming a network of eerie markings that spread as far as he could see. The shadow was right. It wasn't bound by the chamber. It was here in the forest, in the very air he breathed. And it was watching. Jack stumbled forward, his breath quickening. The faint glow of the symbols on the trees pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. Alive, watching, mocking. Every step he took was shadowed by the sense of something unseen just behind him. Yet no matter how quickly he turned, there was nothing but darkness and the tangled forest. He could feel the shadow's presence, a chilling weight on his chest that seemed to deepen with each passing moment. It wasn't a question of if it would strike, but when. After what felt like hours of wandering, Jack emerged into a clearing. The oppressive trees gave way to an open expanse dominated by an ancient, crumbling structure. It looked like a church or what was left of one. The spire had long since fallen, and the walls were choked with creeping vines, their leaves black and glossy like spilled ink. The air here felt heavier, laden with an unnatural silence. Jack hesitated. His instincts screamed to turn back, but the glimmer of torchlight from within the ruined structure drew him in. Someone or something was inside. He wasn't alone. With each step toward the church, his surroundings seemed to warp. The forest grew darker, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. The air carried whispers now, soft, unintelligible, but insistent. His hand twitched toward his belt, where his knife sat, a meager comfort against whatever lay ahead. Inside the church, the torchlight flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows across the walls. As Jack approached the entrance, he saw the source of the light, a group of figures in dark robes standing in a circle. They chanted in low, guttural tones, their voices blending with the whispers that had plagued him in the forest. In the center of the circle lay a woman, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Symbols, identical to those on the trees, were carved into her bare arms, blood trickling down her skin. She writhed against her bonds, but the ropes held firm. Jack's chest tightened. He had seen his share of horrors in the world, but this was something else entirely. The robed figures didn't notice him, their focus consumed by their ritual. Jack crouched behind a broken pew, weighing his options. He could intervene, but against how many? 6? 7? He wasn't sure. And if they had the same connection to the shadow as the forest symbols did, he might be walking into a trap. But the woman's muffled screams pulled at him. He couldn't just leave her. Could he? A tendril of the shadow's voice slid into his mind. She's already lost. You'll accomplish nothing but your own destruction. Walk away. Jack shook his head, trying to block out the voice, but it persisted. They will kill you, Jack. They will make you suffer. For what? One life? How many have you already abandoned? One more makes no difference. His fingers brushed the hilt of his knife. He could almost hear his pulse thudding in his ears. He took a slow, deep breath, and then he moved. Jack sprang from his hiding place, his knife flashing in the dim torchlight. The first robed figure didn't even have time to scream before Jack's blade slit their throat. Blood sprayed across the stone floor, and the chanting stopped abruptly. The others turned, their faces hidden by deep hoods. One raised a hand, and Jack felt a wave of force slam into him, throwing him against the wall. Pain exploded through his back, and he barely managed to roll away as a second figure lunged at him with a rusted blade. Adrenaline surged, dulling the pain. Jack lashed out, catching the second attacker's wrist and driving his knife into their ribs. The figure let out a gurgling gasp before collapsing. The others moved quickly, their movements inhumanly fluid. Jack's mind raced. He was outnumbered and outmatched. The Shadow's voice slithered back into his thoughts. "Run, Jack. Leave her. Save yourself." "No," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. He ducked under another attack, his knife slicing through the fabric of a robe. He could see the woman now, her eyes locked on his, silently begging him to hurry. A robed figure began chanting again, and Jack felt the air grow thick. Shadows coalesced around the figure's hands, forming sharp, jagged shapes. Jack threw his knife, the blade spinning end over end before sinking into the figure's chest. The shadows dissipated, and the figure crumpled. By the time the fight ended, Jack was bloodied and gasping for breath. The robed figures lay dead around him, their bodies unnaturally still, as though life had been drained from them entirely. Jack staggered to the woman and cut her bonds. She sat up, coughing and rubbing her wrists, her eyes darting to the bodies around them. Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Someone who doesn't have time for questions," Jack said, pulling her to her feet. "We need to." The floor beneath them shuddered, and a low growl reverberated through the church. Jack turned to see the bodies of the robed figures dissolving into dark, viscous liquid. The liquid pooled together, bubbling and churning, forming a massive, writhing mass of shadow. The Shadow's voice boomed, filling the chamber. "You cannot fight me, Jack. You cannot win. You only delay the inevitable." Jack gripped the woman's arm tightly, pulling her toward the exit. "Move," he shouted. They ran, the Shadow surging after them, its tendrils slithering across the floor and walls, tearing through the stone like paper. Jack and the woman burst from the crumbling church into the oppressive forest. The Shadow surged behind them, its tendrils tearing through trees, reducing them to splinters. The symbols on the trees pulsed brighter, their glow casting eerie patterns on the forest floor. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony that seemed to come from the very air around them. They reached a clearing with a massive stone monolith in the center, its surface covered in the same glowing runes. Jack's instinct screamed that this was the source, the anchor that allowed the Shadow to exist in the physical world. The woman stumbled to her knees, clutching her arms where the symbols had been carved into her skin. "You brought me here for a reason," she gasped, her voice trembling. "It needs me to finish the ritual, to break free." Jack turned to her, his mind racing. He could see it now, this wasn't about saving her. She was a vessel, a catalyst for whatever the Shadow intended to do. The runes on her arms began glowing, resonating with the symbols on the monolith. The Shadow reared back, towering over them like a living storm. "Kill her, Jack," the Shadow hissed, its voice both seductive and terrifying. "End her life and I will spare you. Walk away. This is not your burden." The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror and pleading. "Don't listen to it," she cried. "If you kill me, it wins. But if you don't," she didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what her words implied. She would die anyway, but the Shadow might remain bound. Jack gritted his teeth. His knife felt impossibly heavy in his hand. Every fiber of his being screamed for a way out, a choice that didn't end in blood or failure. But there was none. The Shadow lunged, its tendrils swarming toward Jack and the woman. Jack acted on instinct, shoving her behind him and raising his knife. The blade glinted in the faint light of the runes, and for a moment, the tendrils hesitated. "Stop running," the Shadow growled, its voice a thunderous roar. "End her. Save yourself." That is your only escape. Jack's mind flashed with memories of his past. Every death he had caused, every decision that had led him to this moment. The weight of his guilt was suffocating. He had sought redemption, but now he realized there was no clean path to it. I'm not afraid of you, Jack spat, gripping the knife tightly. The shadow paused, almost as if amused. You should be. Jack turned to the woman, his voice low and strained. I need you to run. No, she cried. If I leave, it'll... Run, Jack bellowed, shoving her toward the edge of the clearing. The woman hesitated, tears streaming down her face, but then she turned and ran. Jack faced the monolith, the runes glowing brighter as the shadow closed in. He knew what he had to do. Jack plunged the knife into the monolith. A deafening crack split the air, and the runes exploded with light. The shadow let out an unearthly scream, its form writhing and twisting as the light consumed it. The tendrils disintegrated, the darkness peeling away layer by layer. But the cost was immediate. The light from the runes surged into Jack, his body convulsing as the monolith drew on his life force. The ground beneath him trembled, the earth splitting open as the shadow was dragged back into the void it had come from. The woman stopped at the edge of the forest, turning to see Jack standing before the monolith, his body engulfed in light. Jack! She screamed, her voice breaking. Jack turned to her one last time, his face pale but resolute. Go. Live. The light intensified, blinding and all-consuming. The woman shielded her eyes as the ground beneath the monolith collapsed, swallowing the structure, Jack, and the shadow in one final, cataclysmic roar. When the light faded, the forest was silent. The monolith was gone, replaced by a smoldering crater. The woman stood at the edge, staring into the void, tears streaming down her face. The oppressive weight of the shadow was gone, but so was Jack. She fell to her knees, clutching the knife he had left behind. The runes on her arms had faded, but their scars remained, a permanent reminder of what had transpired. In the distance, the forest began to regrow, the trees reclaiming the clearing as if nothing had happened. But the woman knew better. The shadow was gone, but the cost of its banishment would haunt her forever. And somewhere, in the deepest recesses of the void, the shadow whispered faintly, its presence not entirely erased. Nothing stays buried forever.
Sometimes the roads we take are more than just paths to destinations. Some lead us to places we are better off never finding. Take a drive with me down a highway where everything seems wrong from the very start. The night was oppressive, the kind of dark that felt almost tangible, as though the world itself had become smothered under a blanket of black. Sarah had been driving for hours, her headlights barely cutting through the dense fog that had rolled in over the highway. It wasn't unusual for fog to appear late at night, but this felt different. The air was still, almost too still. Not a sound, not even the usual hum of tires against asphalt. Her passenger, Ethan, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We should have turned back, he muttered, glancing out the window at the creeping mist that seemed to cling to everything. Sarah shot him a quick look. We're almost there. You said this place was easy to find. Ethan didn't reply, his lips pressed into a thin line. The map he'd been following had long since become useless, and the GPS had started malfunctioning the moment they turned onto this road. He could have sworn that the last sign they passed had been miles behind them, but now it seemed as if they were driving on a stretch of road that had no end. The same dark trees lined the edges, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, the fog weaving between them like an unholy presence. You sure we're not lost? Ethan asked, his voice a little more anxious now. Sarah didn't answer, her eyes scanning the road ahead. She wasn't sure what to make of the feeling that had crept into her chest. Something in the pit of her stomach gnawed at her, a sense that the highway wasn't just leading them somewhere, but was pulling them there, like a force they couldn't escape. We'll be fine, Sarah said, her voice more to reassure herself than him. But it wasn't fine. The road ahead began to warp, bending unnaturally. Sarah had driven this highway countless times, but now it seemed as if the pavement had become alive, stretching and twisting as though it was trying to lead them off the path. She squinted ahead, her eyes locking on a dark shape emerging from the fog, a figure standing in the middle of the road. "Sarah, stop!" Ethan shouted. She slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just inches from the figure. It was a man, hunched over, his clothes ragged, his face hidden beneath a hood. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then the figure straightened, his head lifting, and their eyes met. But it wasn't his eyes that sent a wave of cold terror through Sarah. It was the hollow emptiness in his gaze, something dark, unfathomable, as if his very being existed in a space beyond her understanding. He didn't speak. He simply raised one hand, pointing down the road. "Do you see that?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. Sarah's gaze followed the line of the man's outstretched finger. In the distance, barely visible through the fog, was a building. It looked like an old gas station, the kind you would pass by without a second thought on any other night. But tonight, the very sight of it sent a shiver through her spine. The man took a step back into the fog, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. "I don't like this," Ethan said, his voice low. "We should leave." But Sarah felt a pull, a deep magnetic force, urging her forward towards that gas station. Something about it felt important. Maybe it was the eerie stillness that seemed to permeate the air, or maybe it was the fact that she had to see it for herself, whatever it was. She couldn't explain it. "I'm going," she said, almost mechanically, as if the decision had already been made for her. Ethan tried to protest, but the words caught in his throat. There was something about Sarah's eyes that made him hesitate, something in the way she was staring ahead as though hypnotized. The car rolled forward again, creeping down the road, and the gas station grew closer. When they reached it, the sign above the door flickered weakly, casting a sickly yellow light over the cracked pavement. The pumps were old, rusted, long since abandoned. But what made Sarah's blood run cold wasn't the building. It was the figure standing in the doorway, the man from before. This time his hood was pulled back, revealing a face twisted and pale, skin stretched over sharp, protruding bones. His mouth hung open, as if he were trying to speak, but no sound came out. His gaze, empty and hollow, locked onto Sarah's as she stopped the car. She should have driven away. She knew that. But the fog thickened, and the world outside seemed to blur, as if the station and the road itself were becoming one. The air in the car was heavy, suffocating. She could barely breathe. "We need to go now," Ethan urged, his voice rising in panic. But it was already too late. The moment Sarah turned the key to drive away, the figure moved, stepping toward the car with an unnatural speed. The headlights flickered, and for a brief, terrible moment, Sarah saw the man's face, grotesque and distorted as he grinned, a grin that seemed too wide, too wrong to belong to any human being. Then everything went dark. The engine sputtered, the lights died, and the car coasted to a stop. Ethan grabbed Sarah's arm, shaking her, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, locked on the figure that stood just outside the car. The man's mouth opened again. This time the voice didn't come from him. It came from everywhere, from the fog, from the road, from the very air around them. "Now you're part of it," the voice whispered. And then there was nothing but silence.